Many colleagues from all sides of this House who have been supportive since the outset, perhaps evidenced by the fact that every political party with elected members in this place is represented in the list of sponsors to this bill. I should add that without the help of the Public Bill Office, I would have no bill to speak to today, and my thanks to them for their help in getting this far. But we've seen tens of thousands of workers forced to the edge of a cliff by employers who have suddenly discovered the value of ignoring loyalty. 30,000 British Airways employees were told to suck up huge wage cuts and slash conditions or join the dole queue. For some, this meant a cut in take-home pay of 60% plus. They were told that they were the lucky ones. Over 10,000 of their colleagues have joined that queue. Like many of my colleagues on the Transport Select Committee, I've received hundreds of emails from BA employees subjected to these tactics. They are individual stories of fear, worry, anxiety, disappointment, anger and resignation. But they also paint a picture of a corporation intent on badness from the start. Workers with decades of service with BA receiving emails just before midnight, advising them to sign on a dotted line or face the sack. Employees recently returned from leave for ill health, being told their annual leave will be slashed or face the sack. People being told their wages will be slashed and they have no option but to accept or face the sack. Mr. Speaker, this is not how a modern, civilised country manages its labour markets. These are the tactics and behaviour of characters from a Dickens novel. Companies behaving like yet another remnant of the 19th century. But no one argues that the economic crisis the world faces means businesses don't have tough decisions to make. Of course they do. The impact of COVID-19 on commerce and industry will not disappear as soon as we've tackled the virus and normality begins to return. The after effects of this will be long-lasting and damaging. But that does not give employers the right to behave like absentee lairds, returning to their assets only to inflict yet more damage on people they appear to hold in contempt. We should expect, and given its various answers and statements on the matter, the Government were fervently hoping that these companies might self-police their behaviour. Most other employers are able to treat their staff fairly, with decency and respect. But it's clear we can't rely on rogue bosses to show that same decency and fairness voluntarily. That's where the state, this Parliament and the UK Government must step in to guarantee that fairness for every worker in the UK. That's what governments around Europe have done in the past. It's one of the sad ironies of the British Airways situation that in the other two countries where their parent company IAG operate, Ireland and Spain, fire and rehire tactics are banned. IAG could not tell their Aer Lingus subsidiary to copy and paste from Willie Walsh and Alex Cruz's playbook because the Irish Dáil took a decision to extend protections to workers in Ireland. And Ireland's economy is better placed, better structured, better regulated than the UK. It should be time for the UK Government to learn lessons from our nearest neighbour and follow their lead. Mr. Speaker, the Government can, in the words of the Prime Minister himself, put its arms around millions of workers across these aisles with one very simple action: putting aside government time for my bill. Get it into committee where we can debate how best to offer workers more protection from rogue bosses and encouraging those yet to be convinced that they should to back this measure. My bill, as it stands, would simply amend the existing Employment Rights Act and equip workers with the tools to protect their living standards virtually overnight. It would put our labour markets on a level playing field with our European friends and allies, and crucially it would put our workers on a level playing field with workers in the rest of Europe. And it would put our businesses on notice that the Victorian era is fit for the history books, not a guide to human resources. As I said to the Minister when we met to discuss the merits and content of my bill, I'm not precious whatsoever about it being my bill, this bill, that makes the changes required. If the UK Government and BAYS can come up with their own plan which achieves the same ends, I will wholeheartedly welcome it. I know that not only would members on this side of the House do the same, but I know that a great many of the Minister's concerned colleagues who have spoken to him about this issue would also appreciate action. Workers out there don't care whose name is on the bill. They care that their interests are being protected and that their jobs aren't used as pawns in a war from which the only winners are the likes of Willie Walsh and well-upholstered shareholders. I should also say that whilst the Minister said that he and the Government could not support the bill at this time, he remained open to looking at the issue and further protections, and I hope to continue that dialogue. But, Mr. Speaker, my bill would make a simple amendment to the Employment Rights Act 1996, adding the re-employment of a worker on less favourable terms and conditions to the definition of unfair dismissal. This would allow employees to use the existing employment tribunal system to enforce their rights if required, and mean employers could no longer act with impunity. Amending the Act in this way would allow employees targeted for fire and rehire to take cases against unscrupulous employers and, where appropriate, secure reinstatement and compensation. In short, my bill creates no extra bureaucracy, no extra administration and no extra complexity, but creates a very necessary protection for workers that employers will be forced to respect or face judicial proceedings. Mr Speaker, I am grateful for the opportunity today to lay out the case for action in this area, but I very much look forward to the Labour Party retabling an Opposition Day motion on this issue to allow us to get into some real discussion and debate on the finer points of this issue, and also look forward to potentially one or two members opposite attempting to justify the actions of rogue employers like Willie Walsh and Alex Cruz. Their actions were and are utterly shameful, immoral and should be illegal. After wrecking thousands of lives, both Mr Walsh and Mr Cruz have now skipped off into the sunset, Mr Walsh with an £800,000 bonus payoff, having thrown over 10,000 loyal staff on the dole in the middle of the biggest economic crisis since the war, and effectively rehired 30,000 more on reduced terms and conditions. BA would tell you that fire and rehire has been taken off the table. Indeed, the outgoing Chief Exec told the Transport Committee just a few weeks ago that that was the case. But there are two problems with that. Firstly, a lot of the damage to thousands of lives has already been done. When you sit in a workforce with effective pay cuts of 40, 50, 60% or take redundancy, and then follow through with the process of accepting voluntary requests and then selecting who was successful in getting their old but less well paid jobs back and making thousands more compulsory redundant, and only then taking fire and rehire off the table, that's callous and fools absolutely no one. Secondly, it seems that there are employees under the BA IAG umbrella who still face being fired and rehired at the turn of the year. So when Alex Cruz confirmed to the committee that it had been taken off the table, he was at best being disingenuous and at worst misleading. And I should say at this point that there is a new management team in place at BA, and I do wish them well in fixing this mess and trying to repair the broken relationship with the workforce. They need a lot of luck. But it's not just British Airways, Mr Speaker. We said that this practice would swiftly be followed by others if the government refused to follow the Prime Minister's warm words with action, and so it's proven, with fellow blue-chip company Centrica British Gas making the same fire rehire threats to over 20,000 of its employees, although they haven't served notice on anyone at this point. We've also seen ground handler Menzies Aviation follow a similar path, despite assuring me personally that it absolutely would not be taking this kind of approach. Many other companies across the UK, including Heathrow, have followed in British Airways' dark and ever-growing shadow. Trade unions across the board, including Unite, GMB, Unison and Prospect, thousands of betrayed BA and Centrica workers, thousands more who fear they will be next, and crucially, I believe a natural majority in this House are all demanding action from the government. The government should act sooner rather than later. Back our constituents and give them the support and protection they deserve, not just in the short term during this pandemic and its economic impact, but for the long term as we collectively build the economic recovery we all need and hope for. But, Mr Speaker, that recovery will be a hollow one if the government leaves workers in the same position they were in previously, at the mercy of corporations who treat the lack of regulation over their actions as a green light to mistreat and bully their employees. We must act to give workers security and dignity at work, and my bill would go some way, only some way, but an important way, to providing that security and dignity, and ask that the government and the benches opposite go that way too and get behind my bill.
That the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Hugh Merriman, Neil Gray, Chris Stevens, Lillian Greenwood, Sarah Olney, Sammy Wilson, Caroline Lucas, Stephen Farry, Claire Hanna, Liz Saville-Roberts, David Linden and myself.
Gavin Newlands.
Employment, Dismissal and Re-employment Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 29th of January.
Friday, the 29th of January. We now have a royal assent. I have to notify the House in accordance with the Royal Assent Act of 1967 that Her Majesty has signified her royal assent to the following act and measure. Prisoners, brackets disclosure information about victims, close brackets Act 2020, General Synod, remote meetings, temporary standing orders, measures 2020. Right, we now come to motion number 2, business of the House, Minister to move.
Big to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Contrary not, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to 7 o'clock. No, we can miss that one. We now come to the motion number 3 on the coronavirus restrictions regulations. I now call the Prime Minister to move. Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that these regulations are approved and that we come together today to implement time-limited restrictions across England from midnight so we can contain the autumn surge of the virus, protect our NHS and save many lives. Of course, this is not something that any of us wanted to do. None of us came into politics to tell people once again to shutter their shops, to furlough their staff or stay away from their friends and family. And I'm common with all members, feel the pain and anxiety that we're all going to share in the month ahead. But as Prime Minister, when I'm confronted with data that projects our NHS could even collapse, with deaths in the second wave potentially exceeding those of the first, and when I look at what is happening now among some of our continental friends, and I see doctors who've tested positive are being ordered, alas, to work on COVID wards, and patients airlifted to hospitals in some other countries simply to make space, I can reach only one conclusion. I'm not prepared to take the risk with the lives of the British people. And I know, Mr. Speaker, it might be tempting to think that because some progress has been made, we just need to stay the course and see through our locally led approach. And it is true that the extraordinary efforts of millions across the country, especially those in high and very high alert level areas, they have made a difference, Mr. Speaker, suppressing the reproduction rate of the virus below where it would otherwise have been. And I want to record again my thanks to the millions who've put up with local restrictions. I want to thank the local leaders who've understood the gravity of the position. But I'm sorry to say that the number of COVID patients in some hospitals is already higher than at the peak of the first wave. Even in the southwest, which has so far had lower case rates than most of the rest of the country, hospital admissions are over halfway to their first wave peak. SAGE's latest analysis, published on Friday, suggests that the R remains above 1 in every part of England, which means that the virus is continuing to grow among the population. And every day that the number is above 1, another day is another day that the number of cases will rise, locking in more hospital admissions and, alas, more fatalities, pushing the NHS ever closer to the moment when it cannot cope. And I give way to the honourable member.
Prime Minister, for giving way. Prime Minister, every one of us in this House has received numerous emails and telephone contacts about the closure of church services. I understand that, and I'm just making a plea to the Prime Minister, would that be, or could that be reviewed? Because for many, many people, it's the only outing they have of the week, the only opportunity to have any contact with other people for prayer and contemplation as well. In Northern Ireland, we've been able to do that with the Mass, the face and the space, and we've done that, and the churches have been able to continue. Is it possible, Prime Minister, that could be looked at? Because I believe that people across the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland would appreciate that, especially England today. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that the honourable gentleman speaks for many people in this House in raising the concern that he does, and I feel it very, very deeply. It is an awful thing to restrict people's ability to worship in a communal way. Obviously, as he knows, what we are allowing is private worship, but for many people that will not be enough. And I think the best I can really say to him, in all reality, is that if we can get through this package of measures tonight, then I think we have a very good prospect of allowing everybody to return to communal worship in time for Christmas and other celebrations in December. Mr. Speaker, if we're going to, the course we have before us is to prevent the R from going back, from remaining above 1 and to get it down. Because otherwise, we face a bleak and an uncertain future of steadily rising infections and admissions until, as I say, the capacity of the NHS is breached. And I know that there has been some debate about the projections from some of these models, and I'll give way on that point.
On uncertainty, we've had a week of uncertainty from the Prime Minister and his Cabinet on whether the extension of furlough will apply to Scotland if Scotland chooses to go into lockdown and needs to go into lockdown beyond the 2nd of December. And that comes after the Prime Minister's government refused the request of the Scottish Government, the Welsh and the Northern Irish of the furlough support at the end of September. So can the Prime Minister finally provide us with a clear, unambiguous answer as to whether, if Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland request 80% furlough after the 2nd of December, that will be granted?
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman is in the position of one who can't take yes for an answer. I will. Not only will I come to that point later, but my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will be saying more about that matter tomorrow, and he can interrogate him. But what I will say on the point of uncertainties, there has been a debate about the statistics. I know about how big the loss of life might be, or the precise point at which the NHS might be overwhelmed. But all the scientific experts that I have talked to are unanimous on one point. As the Chief Medical Officer has said, if we did not act now, the chances of the NHS being in extraordinary trouble in December will be very, very high. And be in no doubt, Mr. Speaker, what that means for our country and for our society. It means that the precious principle of care for everyone who needs it, whoever they are, whenever they need it, that principle could be shattered for the first time in our experience. It means those who are sick and suffering and in need of help could be turned away because there was no room in our hospitals, Mr. Speaker, even in East Sussex, Mr. Speaker. And I'll give way to the honourable member.
Well, I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and all of us in this place will be concerned about saving lives. What evidence has he received that we will save more lives by the lockdown that he proposes than we will lose from public health, from lack of jobs, from mental health crisis? Because that's the evidence that I seek, Prime Minister, today in order to cast my vote his way.
Mr. Speaker, he raises a very important point, and that's the crux of the debate. But alas, we as leaders and as politicians have to look at the immediate peril that we face. I don't in any way minimise the risks to mental health, to physical health that come from the measures that we have to apply. And that's, of course, why we debate and we insist that we explore every other avenue before we go down that route. But we have to look at the real risk of mortality, and mortality on what I think would be a grievous scale that would stem from doing nothing. And to give him a picture of what it would mean those who are sick, who are suffering or in need of help, could be turned away because there was no room in our hospitals in a moment. Doctors and nurses could be forced to make impossible choices about which patients would live and would die, who would get oxygen and who couldn't. And I know that there are some members, like my honourable friend, who are hearing from their local hospitals that the pressure is not that great yet. But the whole point about a national service, a national health service, is that when hospitals in one part of the country are overrun, sick patients are transferred to another until the whole system falls over. And let me be clear that this existential threat to our NHS comes not from focusing too much on coronavirus, as is sometimes asserted, but from not focusing enough. Because if we fail to get coronavirus under control, it is the sheer weight of demand from COVID patients that would not only lead to the COVID casualties that I've described, but which would deprive other patients of the care they need. We simply cannot reach the point where our National Health Service is no longer there for everyone. And Mr. Speaker, this fate is not inevitable. We're moving to these national measures here when the rate both of deaths and infections is lower than they were, for instance, in France when President Macron took similar steps. If we act now and act decisively, we can stem the rising waters before our defences are breached, and I'll give way to the member opposite.
Extremely grateful to the Prime Minister. I accept his logic and think it is far more dangerous to do nothing than to do what he proposes. But does he accept that we need to learn some serious lessons from the first lockdown, in particular the impact on cancer patients? There was a 100,000 backlog when it came to treatment and diagnosis at one point. Cancer Research UK estimate that 35,000 people might unnecessarily lose their lives to cancer because of wrong decisions. Will he accept that whilst there are many hospitals that are, shall I say, clean sites, which is not where COVID is not being treated or is present, there's an opportunity then to use those sites to treat cancer patients, to catch up with cancer and to save those lives and not make the same mistakes as we did first time?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is exactly right, and he's encapsulated the argument that we make. And we've talked to repeatedly, my honourable friend, the Health Secretary, and I have talked repeatedly to Simon Stevens, the NHS, and his teams about making sure that throughout this period we continue to look after cancer patients, those who need decisive care that the NHS can provide. And this approach, these regulations, I do believe are the way that we can do that. Mr. Speaker, I know there are many in this House who are concerned about how long these measures might last, and that if people vote for these regulations today, they could suddenly find that we're trapped with these national measures for months on end. So let me level with the House. Of course, I can't say exactly where the epidemiology will be by the 2nd of December, but what I can say is that the national measures that I hope the House will vote on tonight are time limited. It is not that we choose to stop them, they legally expire. So whatever we do from the 2nd of December will require a fresh mandate and a fresh vote from this House. And as I have made clear, it is my express intent that we should return to a tiered system on a local and a regional basis according to the latest data and trends. Mr. Speaker, the whole House will share my sorrow and regret at the necessity of these measures, which I know is a perspective shared by my right honourable friend. I'm happy to give way to him.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister, and I've listened carefully to his argument, and I've looked at the data very carefully. What I'm troubled by, when I've looked at the basis on which the modelling's been done, that both SAGE and also the NHS, is the modelling is done, it doesn't take into account the effect of the introduction of the tiers system, and it doesn't take into account any of the effects of that. And I think, therefore, we've acted too soon, because we're starting now to see the tier system working. The data yesterday from Liverpool, published by Steve Rotherham, is very encouraging. I think it shows the tier system is working, but the modelling the NHS is using for its capacity usage doesn't take into account that introduction at all.
Well, no, but Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend makes a very, very important point, and he's expressing a point of view that is shared by many people that I've talked to. Alas, I believe that he's wrong, and the facts don't support it. I've looked at the data, and unfortunately, what we have is hospitalisations mounting very, very steadily, and those are leading indicators, as he knows, of fatalities. 2,000 more people in COVID wards this time than there were last week. 25% more today than there were last week. and 397 deaths, alas, announced tragically yesterday, more than we've had for many months, Mr. Speaker. The curve is already unmistakable and, alas, incontestable. I give way to my honourable friend.
Well, friend, for giving way. In the last 2 weeks, we've gone from seeing cases mainly among young people to being mainly among older people. We've seen it going from a problem in a few cities to a problem across the country. Does the honourable friend agree with me that you don't need a fancy model to see the numbers piling up in hospital, to see what's happened in France because they haven't taken action as quickly as we have, and to know that the thing to do is to take action now to not just save lives but to save the economy as well?
Well, the economic dimension of what we're doing is absolutely right, and the argument, as he rightly says, works both ways. But I know how difficult it is, particularly for businesses who'd just got back on their feet, Mr. Speaker, who've done their level best to make themselves COVID secure, installing hand washing stations, plexiglass screens, one-way systems, and as the Chancellor has set out, we will do whatever it takes to support them. We protected almost 10 million jobs with furlough, and we're now extending this scheme throughout November. We've already paid out £13 billion to help support the self-employed, and we're now doubling our support from 40 to 80% of trading profits for the self-employed for this month. We're providing cash grants of up to £3,000 per month for businesses who are closed, worth out over £1 billion a month and benefiting over 600,000 business premises. We're giving funding of £1.1 billion to local authorities in England, further to support businesses and their local economy in the winter months. And I give way with pleasure to the gentleman opposite.
The Prime Minister for giving way. He accused us of not being able to take yes for an answer on differentiated furlough for the other nations of the UK earlier. The problem, Prime Minister, is we've not heard a clear, unequivocal yes to the question. So can he sort that now? If Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland needs to introduce lockdown measures at different times to England, will the Chancellor be there to support us with furlough?
Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, I really think yes. I really think I don't know how to exhaust my affirmative vocabulary any further. But you know, they won't take yes for an answer, Mr. Speaker. All of this comes on top, as the honourable gentleman knows, with great respect, Mr. Speaker. I think I've answered the question that I think that my friends opposite are going to pose. It comes on top of the more than 200 billion we provided since March, and we will also ensure that throughout this period our schools stay open. We will not allow this virus to do any further damage to the future of our children. I said in the summer we had a moral duty to reopen our schools as soon as it was safe to do so, and that they would be the last element, the schools would be the last element of our society to close down again. We have stuck to that pledge, Mr. Speaker. Our schools will remain open, as will colleges, universities, childcare and early years settings. Mr. Speaker, the measures before the House are designed to arrest the virus, to drive it down and get on top of it once and for all. And if we are able to test on a big enough scale to identify the people who are infected, often without symptoms, and who unwittingly, asymptomatically, pass the virus to others, then those people will be helped immediately, this is the key thing, immediately to self-isolate and to break the chains of transmission, reducing the spread of the virus, reducing the numbers of people in hospital and the numbers of people dying. And I think that if we all play our part in this system, it could be a hugely valuable weapon in our fight against COVID in the short, medium and the long term, and an alternative to the blanket restrictions that have been imposed in so many parts of the world. We're piloting this week a mass test in Liverpool, where an immense effort benefiting from the logistical skill of the armed services will offer everyone a test, and our aim is to make mass and repeated testing available for everyone across the country. Thanks to the pioneering work of British scientists, we already have a life-saving treatment for COVID and the genuine possibility of a safe and effective vaccine next year. Taken together, these achievements provide every reason for confidence that our country can and will pull through this crisis, and that our ingenuity will prove equal to the challenge. No, I won't. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, this year, I'm finishing off. Mr. Speaker, this year and the whole government has asked much of the British people, more than any Prime Minister, I believe, has asked of the British people in peacetime. And I have to say that the public have responded magnificently and selflessly, putting their lives on hold, bearing any burden, overcoming every obstacle and tolerating every disruption and inconvenience, no matter how large or small or inconsistent, Mr. Speaker, so that they can do the right thing by their fellow citizens. And I wish that it had been enough to defeat this autumn surge. But while I am more optimistic about the medium and long-term future than I have been for many months, there can be no doubt that the situation before us today is grave and the need for action acute. It is absolutely right for this House to have doubts.
Sorry, Prime Minister. Mr. Morrison, we can't read newspapers in the chamber. Prime Minister.
I'm glad. It's absolutely right for honourable members to consult relevant documents that may contain information to the advantage and betterment of the House. But
Horoscope, come on, Prime Minister.
I can assure my honourable friend that his future is rosy. It is right for this House, for members on all sides of this House, to have the doubts that have been expressed and to seek answers from me and to give and to provide scrutiny. That is the purpose and duty of the House of Commons. But while it pains me to call for such restrictions on lives, liberty and business, I have no doubt that these restrictions represent the best and safest path for our country, our people and our economy. So now is the time for us to put our differences aside, focus on the next 4 weeks, getting this virus back in its box, Mr. Speaker, and I know that once again our amazing country will respond to adversity by doing what is right, staying at home, protecting the NHS and saving lives, and in that spirit I commend these regulations to the House.
The question is, as on the order paper, I call the Leader of the Opposition. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know there's a lot of members who want to speak, particularly on the opposite benches, and so I'll keep my remarks brief. Nobody votes for the regulations today with anything other than a heavy heart, on both sides. I didn't come into Parliament to restrict people's freedoms, to prevent people meeting their friends and their loved ones, to decide when people can and can't leave their home, or how many people may attend a funeral. I don't want Parliament to be closing businesses, gyms, bars or places of worship. Frankly, I don't want Parliament to be legislating on any of these issues, least of all after the British public have made so many enormous sacrifices already. Parliament probably should have had more time to scrutinise these regulations, to amend them and to consult. There are going to be anomalies and inconsistencies, and we can't amend them, and they probably could have been ironed out. I'm very concerned about the impact on businesses who spent thousands of pounds becoming COVID secure, doing everything the government asked, only now to be forced to shut. But while these regulations are not in any way desirable or perfect, they are now necessary because the government's lost control of the virus, and we will support them. The country is at, indeed, we're several weeks past a tipping point in the fight against the virus. On Monday, and we must never forget this, 397 people lost their lives to COVID-19. Over 1,000 patients were on ventilators, and there are over 20,000 positive cases. To anybody who disputes the trajectory of the virus or what the cost of inaction would be, I would point out that when Sage warned 44 days ago that if we don't act now there will be catastrophic consequences, then 6 weeks or so ago there were 11 deaths from COVID-19, just over 4,000 infections and 181 people on ventilators. That's not graphs, that's not projections, that's the grim facts in the last few weeks. And we know that the figures double and then double and double again. And that direction of travel has been clear for some time. And I'm afraid the reality is that the two pillars of the government strategy, the £12 billion track and trace, the regional restrictions, have been washed away by the second wave. And if we're to have any chance of getting the virus back under control, to prevent many more people falling ill and losing their loved ones, and to protect the NHS, we do need now to take decisive action. There are some wider points I want to raise, and I suspect they're shared points, because there does need to be additional support during the lockdown. This is going to be incredibly hard for the British public. Millions of people tonight are really anxious about what's going to happen over the coming weeks, anxious on the health front for themselves, their friends and their family, anxious about their jobs. That's why we called some weeks ago for the restrictions to be put in place when there could have been a shorter period, which would have been better on the health front, less lives lost, and better on the economic front. Yeah, but more broadly, I was struck by the words of the Chief Executive of Mind earlier this week, who warned that the second lockdown would be likely to be even harder on people's mental health. And we know there's already been a large increase in the demand for mental health services. So there needs to be emergency support in the next few weeks to address this. And I think that's a cross-party issue that we can work on together. I'm also concerned about domestic violence. This was one of the issues from the first lockdown. We saw an appalling rise in domestic violence during that period. Charities like Refuge reported a 50% increase in demands to its helpline, and there was a 300% increase in visits to its website. I passionately believe that we need to do more, much more as a country and a parliament to tackle this. And that must start with a clear, well-resourced plan for addressing domestic abuse during this lockdown and this winter. I want to turn to the question of faith, which has already been raised. These regulations will have a serious impact on faith communities and places of worship. There's real concern across faiths about the lack of consultation. I hope the government can urgently address that, including convening the Places of Worship Task Force. Of course.
All the leaders of every single faith community have now written to the government asking for the evidence behind this closure of churches during the next 4 weeks. And the fact is, there is almost certainly no evidence. Will the Right Honourable Gentleman confirm that every faith community, Muslims, Jews, Christians, have really done their best to comply with cleansing in every other way? And will he demand of the government now that these churches, mosques, temples are open just as soon as possible?
On the question of whether all faiths have done their level best to comply, I do agree. A huge amount of effort has gone in places of worship and many other places, frankly, to try to defeat the virus. The British public have done a huge amount, and serve all the institutions, organisation of faith to try to keep the virus down. But the truth is, it's out of control. I do think the task force needs to be convened so that these issues can be discussed during the next few days and weeks, because this is a very deep issue for many, many people that we understand. I will, of course.
I'm extremely grateful for Aaron. Very important points here. Would you accept that churches and other faith communities, their buildings, whilst the buildings themselves may not be sacred, what goes on within them is, and that we've noticed over the last few months that the importance of verbal cues, of being non-verbal cues, of the fact that people are gathered together allows people to get out to help one another when they are mentally or emotionally struggling. And so the closure of these places, whilst I understand the logic, is potentially hugely damaging to people's mental health and well-being. So would you agree that this needs to be reviewed at the soonest possible opportunity?
I do agree it should be reviewed as soon as possible. I think that's probably a shared sentiment across the House. Nobody wants these measures to be put in place. It's a bit like the care homes issue that I raised earlier on. We all know the risk to care homes from the first phase of the pandemic, and we all know the toll that the next few weeks is going to take, not only on those in care homes, but to the families that are desperate to visit those in care homes, which is why I think on a cross-party basis it may be possible to find a way to have safe visits during the next few weeks. These are very difficult questions. Mr. Speaker, can I also turn to the question of homelessness, which is already a moral emergency in this country? And the lockdown now comes as the weather has turned, the winter is setting in, and sleeping rough is more dangerous than ever. So it's vital that the government restarts the Everybody In programme and reintroduces the evictions ban so that we don't see a further spike in homelessness. That now needs to be done urgently. More broadly than that, the Prime Minister needs to show that he's got a plan beyond the 2nd of December to control the virus and rebuild the economy, and a clear strategy to make sure that we never, ever get into this situation again. The explanatory notes in the regulations show just how vague the plans for the 2nd of December are. They say this, and I quote from them: "It is expected that at the end of the 28-day period, the previous alert levels introduced in October will once again be brought into force. This policy is subject to review." There are millions of people who've been in restrictions for many months who are going to be very worried about that paragraph. If you take Leicester, Leicester's been in restrictions for over 120 days. It's very hard to make the argument to the people of Leicester that the restrictions are working. It's very hard to make the argument to the people of Greater Manchester, who were in the equivalent of Tier 2 restrictions for 6 weeks, that the tiered system is working. Because the public's experience of the tiered system is that if you're in Tier 1 or the equivalent, you end up in Tier 2. And if you've been in Tier 2, sometimes for weeks on end, you drift towards Tier 3. If the tier system worked, Tier 2 areas would go back to Tier 1. They would go back to Tier 1. That would be success. But actually, the vast majority of them, if not all of them, have gone up to Tier 3. So the idea, and the Prime Minister sometimes says a party political issue, it isn't. If the idea at the end of the exercise on the 2nd of December is to go back to the system we're leaving tonight, when that system, certainly in Tier 1 and 2, simply isn't working, is very hard for the public, because they know that's not going to keep them safe. They know that puts further health and economic issues in issue, and they know that means that Christmas isn't going to be what it could be. I will, of course.
He's talking about my constituency. I would gently point out to him that during the period of the most restrictions in Leicester, the number of cases did come down from 160 to 25 per 100,000. So actually, when you do have tough controls of the kind that we're about to vote to bring in today, it does work.
Just to help people, we've got a few that's now intervened a couple of times. You would understand that we do want to get everybody in. If you go down the list, you will appreciate it, I'm sure. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've looked at the Leicester figures on a frequent basis. They do go up and down, but Leicester's never come out of the restrictions. It's a point I've been making. It isn't a party political point. The point is, if you're in restrictions and you don't come out, then the restrictions aren't working. If you're in Tier 2 restrictions and you end up in Tier 3, then Tier 2 didn't work. To go back to that system doesn't make any sense. And for heaven's sake, we've got to use the next 4 weeks to come up with something better than that for the 2nd of December. Otherwise, we'll do the usual thing, which is to pretend something's going to happen on the 2nd of December, and then when we get there, find out that what was said would happen won't happen. And I can predict what's going to happen, because it's happened so many times in the last 7 months. The Prime Minister says X won't happen, X will happen. It does happen, and we start all over again. And it's not fair to the British public to pretend that that's what's going to happen on the 2nd of December. I will give way.
Honourable Gentleman, is he not confounding his own logic? Because he spent the past several days berating the government for not introducing a circuit breaker, but at no time did I hear him explain how we were going to leave the circuit break, which it seems to me was the half-term holiday simply rebadged.
The lower the rate of infection, the lower the admissions, the more chance there is to get the virus under control. That's why you have to go early. If you want to safeguard the economy, go early. How on earth has it helped the British economy to delay and to go into a lockdown for 4 weeks when, on the 21st of September, Sage was saying it could be 2 to 3 weeks? How on earth has it helped the British economy to miss the chance to do lockdown over half term? All members will have seen the data. about schools. We all want schools to stay open. How on earth did it make sense to miss half-term? Most schools would happily have said, we'll go up early, the Thursday before half-term, and we'll use Monday, Tuesday and an inset day. You could have probably got the best part of 2 weeks of schools being closed naturally because of half-term and had the lockdown over then. And I don't think there can be anybody in this House who doesn't think that would have been a better period for a circuit break, lockdown, call it what you like. It has not helped the economy to waste 3 weeks. Only then, if at the end of that 3 weeks the Prime Minister could say, well, there we are, the tiered system's now working, I'm going to stick with it, that would be one thing. But the Prime Minister is now saying, I'm going to do the lockdown. That's failure. That's failure. And the next 4 weeks cannot be wasted. Cannot be wasted. We have got to fix, test, trace and isolate. The last figures show that in just 1 week, 113,000 contacts were missed by the system. 4 in 10 people who should be contacted are not being contacted under the system. If you're not contacted, you cannot isolate. That's 113,000. It's not just a number. That's 113,000 people walking around our communities when they should have been self-isolating. Hands up if you think that's helped to control the virus. We've been on about the track, trace and isolate system for months. The promises come by the wheelbarrow, the delivery never. Only 20% of people who should be isolating are doing it. Something is going wrong. Just continually pushing away challenge, pretending the problem doesn't exist, is a huge part of the problem. And those figures have got to turn around, and they've got to turn around in the next 4 weeks, because if we get to the 2nd of December and those problems are still in the system, we will be going around this circuit for many, many months to come. If this isn't fixed in the next 4 weeks, there are massive problems. The government's also got to stop sending constant mixed messages. Go back to work. Even if you can work from home, civil servants, get to work. Only a week later to say, stay at home. The constant changing of the economic plans is creating even more uncertainty. There have been huge mistakes made in recent weeks during this pandemic. We've been told so many times by the Prime Minister, often on a Wednesday afternoon, there's a plan to prevent a second wave, it's working. Well, there wasn't, and it didn't. And now, less than 4 months after the Prime Minister told us that this would all be over by Christmas, we're being asked to approve emergency regulations to shut the country down. That's a terrible thing for the country to go through. But there isn't any excuse for inaction or for allowing the virus to get further out of control. So Labour will act in the national interest, and we will vote for these restrictions, these regulations tonight.
Can I say to members, we're going to start with a 4-minute limit, and I start with Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all say to my right honourable friend that I don't envy him and the government the decisions that they're having to take and the difficult position that they find themselves in. This pandemic has challenged governments across the world, and ministers have been under relentless pressure in dealing with this issue. But just as ministers are making tough decisions, so are Parliament. And Parliament will make better decisions if it is fully and properly informed. I want to comment on the circuit breaker idea, because I looked at the SAGE paper of the 21st of September, and what was absolutely clear was this was not a 2 to 3 week circuit breaker, full stop, end of story. It would have had to have been repeated, possibly again and again and again, and I doubt if any economy could have borne the irreparable damage that would have done, with the impact on lives that would have had, which would have been significant. Of course, the government introduced the tiered approach, and I would echo the comments made by my right honourable friend, the member for the Forest of Dean, that one of the issues with the tiered approach is that we haven't had a proper analysis of how that has, the impact that has had. The evidence is, from Liverpool, that cases are falling. I raised this in a briefing the other day and was told that was because fewer students were coming forward to be tested. But when you look at the figures, actually the number of cases is falling across the age ranges. We need to have that proper assessment of how that tier system is working. But there are other examples of where figures have been used in a way that I think has been unhelpful to Parliament and to the public. Let me take the 4,000 figure. It appears that the decision to go towards this lockdown was partly, mainly, to some extent, based on the prediction of 4,000 deaths a day. Yet if you look at the trajectory shown in that graph that went to 4,000 deaths a day, we would have reached 1,000 deaths a day by the end of October. Now, the average in the last week of October was 259 by my calculation. Each of those deaths is a sadness, and our thoughts are with the families. But it is not 1,000 deaths a day. So the prediction was wrong before it was even used. And this leads to a problem for the government, because for many people, it looks as if the figures are chosen to support the policy rather than the policy being based on the figures. So we need these proper analyses. I say that to my right honourable friend. We need to know the details behind these models. We need to be able to assess the validity of those models. But there's one set of data that has not been available throughout, and that is a lack of data about the costs of the decisions that are being taken. Costs for non-COVID treatment in NHS, non-COVID deaths, domestic abuse, mental health, possibly more suicides, and of course costs to the economy. Jobs lost, livelihoods shattered, businesses failing, whole sectors damaged. What sort of airline industry are we going to have coming out of this? What sort of hospitality sector? How many small independent shops will be left? The government must have made this analysis, they must have made this assessment, let us see it and make our own judgments. I just want to make one word about public worship and echo the concerns of others. My concern is that the government today, making it illegal to conduct an act of public worship for the best of intentions, sets a precedent that could be misused for a government in the future with the worst of intentions. And it has unintended consequences. The COVID Secure Remembrance Service in Worcester Cathedral is now going to be turned into a pre-recorded online service. Surely those men and women who gave down their lives for our freedom deserve better than this. The public and Parliament want to support the government to take the right decisions. To do that, we need to have the right figures, the right data and the proper information.
We have now the SNP spokesperson, Patrick Grady.
Mr Speaker, congratulations on your anniversary. I should say in the SNP we're not unused to the Prime Minister scuttling out before our spokesperson gets to their feet, but the fact that he couldn't spend 4 minutes to listen to his predecessor I think is extremely unfortunate. And like her, I want to acknowledge the personal tragedies and loss of life caused by the pandemic and extend our condolences to everyone who's lost a loved one this year. And I want to be as brief as I can because none of us want to deny the 48 Tory backbenchers who are lined up on the call list to make their views known to their own government. And perhaps even more, incidentally, would be taking part if the government was allowing members to continue to contribute virtually in this chamber. Asking members to travel to the public, asking members to travel hundreds of miles to Westminster while the public are being asked for home is increasingly untenable, and it puts too many staff at this House at risk. And perhaps it suits the government not to hear from its own backbenchers who are in high-risk categories, constituencies or households. And in any event, Mr Speaker, if the evil standing orders hadn't been suspended during the pandemic, this motion would be subject to the double majority procedure, which would have the effect of negating any votes cast by MPs from Scotland. So I can confirm that the SNP won't be taking part in any division that arises on this motion, and that probably gives the government some comfort in the lobbies. And that's because the development and implementation of public health policy is devolved across the United Kingdom, and it's right that the relevant legislatures make decisions for their areas and do not interfere in the decisions of others. But the Tory government's continued delays and obfuscation on the provision of economic support, especially for job retention and furlough, has effectively interfered with the ability of the devolved administrations to make the decisions that they might have wanted to. So even if we're not voting on the motion before us this evening, we have to use this opportunity to press the government yet again, because the obfuscation is continuing, even at Prime Minister's questions, even in the responses of the Prime Minister to my honourable friends who intervened on him. On Monday, to members across the House from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the Prime Minister kept saying that furlough was UK-wide. Then conveniently, in response to the honourable member for Murray, he said, of course furlough would be available whenever the devolved administrations need it. And then today at Prime Minister's questions, he said, well, we have to wait for the Chancellor to make a statement tomorrow. And he repeatedly says, oh, the SNP won't take yes for an answer. We'll take yes for an answer when it's put in writing to the Scottish Government and it's clear and unambiguous. This Tory Government has to urgently engage with the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and confirm that if any of these governments move all or part of their territories into lockdown-level restrictions with the closure of non-essential retail, hospitality and leisure, that funding will be available on the current furlough terms for employers to retain staff at 80% of their wages. The Scottish Government is also still waiting for clarity on Barnett consequentials as a result of increased spending for English local government. And there's still no clarity on whether the unlimited payments for business support in England will be made available on a similar demand-led basis for Scotland. So this has to come in writing on usual channel terms from the Chancellor before he gets up and makes a statement in the House tomorrow. As I said to the Prime Minister in the Chamber on Monday, his furlough scheme is in place across the UK until December of this year. The equivalent scheme in Germany is in place until December 2021. That is the kind of certainty that employers and employees alike are crying out for. That is the kind of certainty that businesses need to plan for and adapt to a health and economic crisis that will not go away anytime soon. Which is why the Government has to use this time wisely and well. It must use the period of heavier restrictions to work with the devolved administrations to improve test and trace across the United Kingdom, to make sure that capacity and support gets to where it is needed in the 4 health services, and it has to put in place provision to support businesses and the economy in a way that will provide certainty for however long the crisis lasts. Mr Speaker, I want to acknowledge, as the First Minister of Scotland has repeatedly done, that lockdown is tough. There are hard times behind us and there are hard times ahead, and all of us in the SNP want to say thank you. Thank you to our amazing NHS and social care workers, to others on the front line. Thank you to the business owners that are being forced to close, to their employers, their employees, who are making huge sacrifices, to the excluded, who've had no support whatsoever from this government and are still holding their heads high. The rules that are being enforced in England today and the restrictions that are in place elsewhere in the UK are difficult, but they are necessary. They help us to protect ourselves, they undoubtedly help us to protect our loved ones and those around us, and they help wider communities. They definitely help to protect our NHS, and ultimately they help to save lives. So we thank everyone making sacrifices to follow these restrictions, and together we will get through this.
Nice one,
Mr Speaker, can I say that I agree with what the Honourable Member for Glasgow North was saying in giving thanks and in recognising the sacrifice that many have made in their lives, in their work and in their relationships. Where the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister agree on these regulations, I shall agree as well. Were it possible to put down amendments, I would have done. I've been to 3 church services recently. One was for a funeral, one was morning service on Sunday, and the other was the monthly communion in St Margaret's, where I'm the parliamentary warden. All of those were COVID safe. I believe that if we have to come back to this again, government ought to be able to find a way with the faith leaders, the Jews, the Muslims, the Christians and other faith groups, as to how they can provide at least a body of people together with the celebrant, and others may then participate remotely. If I can also say that for 34 years, Pamela Carrington, who's looked after successive rectors of St Margaret's, Westminster, is retiring. I paid tribute to her this morning, and I hope it may be possible that in future, Mr Speaker, we could ask you to make a presentation to Pamela Carrington in recognition of all the support she's given to members of Parliament, and we can thank you for letting us use your dining room in normal times for our monthly breakfast too. For these regulations, there's a provision for the centenary of the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey. I'm glad that's been built in, and that was thoughtful. And perhaps as a result of the work of Coxon Ian Mackenzie in my constituency, who raised the question of the Submariners Association Memorial on the embankment, that the provision for remembrance attendance appropriately and safely is in these regulations. I give support to that. I want to come to the points where I believe we've not got it right. I do believe that 2 people playing tennis separated by a net can do so safely, and safely as they can if they went for a walk. I think the golf restrictions are unnecessary. There's obviously a responsibility on the club or the provision of the premises, but I think that should be possible. If I can go for a walk with a dog, or be taken for a walk with a cat, or fly after my parrot, I haven't got any of those, I think I ought to be able to go around with golf clubs as well. And there are interesting questions as to whether swimming, as long as you don't have infection risks in changing rooms, can be safe. In fact, basically, all these separated sports, I think, should be allowed. The more intimate ones, like wrestling, I can see the problem with, and other recreations of that kind. But I believe that we ought to be able to make provision for people to get exercise, doing the kinds of things that they... I give way. A wrestler?
Wrestling, but on physical activity, I'm very grateful for him for giving way. I've just heard from councillors in my constituency that under the restrictions, a skate park for young people has got to be closed. How can this be sensible when young people need something to do, when actually it'll just end up being damaged while it's closed, while they're trying to break into it? They can socially distance and have physical activity, which is also good for their mental health.
I hope that the Secretary of State for Health will pass that on to relevant people and see if they can make provision and give guidance. Obviously, there are going to be boundary problems. Going from one side of saying yes to one side saying no ought to have a space in between where, under conditions, it's possible. We all have to accept responsibility for contributing to the reduced social contact, the reduced chance of risk. But I think that if we do those things, we can learn from what we've done in the past, and we can do it better in the future. And I hope that this, in effect, month of restrictions has the effect that we all want it to achieve. I want to finish by saying that we aren't just looking at these regulations. And incidentally, I still criticise the government for using the COVID provisions to bring forward the regulation to put extra stories on leaseholders' blocks of flats. I think that was improper, it wasn't necessary, and it shouldn't have happened. I return to the last point, which the Chancellor and others will be dealing with, which is what is the compensation going to be to those who are affected, who aren't getting support? The people in the events industry, whether in music or exhibitions or the like, the people in the freelance sector, which has been a growing part of our economy for the last 20 years, who seem to be hung out to dry. And for those who have started new businesses, because we know that 4 out of 5 new businesses don't last, those who have started new businesses in the last year or so seem to be excluded. I believe we have a duty to do more for those people. The excluded should be included.
Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will not be supporting the government in these regulations in the lobby later on this afternoon for 2 reasons. Well, there are 2 reasons for a lockdown. One is to save lives, and the other one is to buy time to improve the situation. I don't believe that when one looks at the details that the government have either provided the information necessary to vote on those issues, or secondly, one can have any faith that they will improve the situation as we have it at the present time. My right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, gave a devastating case of the incompetence of the government over this period. If we look at saving lives, the problem is, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have had exaggerated claims, both by the government and some of the scientific advisors, about the consequences of not having a lockdown. And undoubtedly people are dying of this dreadful disease. But we have not been given the other side of the equation. We have not been told how many people will die of cancer and various other treatments. We've not been told how many people are likely to commit suicide. In order for us to take a decision in the round, we need both of those figures. We need the figures for the economic catastrophe that is happening in my constituency and other parts of the country because of the lockdown and the long-term consequences on jobs for the people that we all represent. So that's one side. We simply don't have the information about that. In terms of improving the situation, we have a national test and trace system that doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the government doesn't want it to work. It doesn't work because it is fundamentally flawed. If you have a system where contracts are given out to private companies beforehand, and they need to be nimble on their feet and act quickly in order to respond to a particular outbreak, often the contracts can't respond to that. There was a case in the centre of Manchester where the central test and trace system walked off site because the contract said they didn't have to work after 10 o'clock. Simply, the central system won't work. They can't pass the information on within time. The responses are getting back to people who can do something about it in over 3 days. I talked to the North West Regional Health people earlier this week, and they said their time for returning the information was over 3 days, where if people are going to infect other people, then the time has gone. It doesn't work because it's centralised. The history of public health in this country is of decentralisation, where local people can go, find out where there is a problem, whether it's in a school, a factory, a street, and do something about it, test and get people to isolate. The central system won't work. If I believed the government were going to improve it over that period, then I might be tempted to vote for these regulations, but they are not. The government have failed to give us information, not just on the economy and on the other side of the equation, the damage caused to people's health. They have failed to give us the information on what is happening in the health service. So I cannot join them in the lobby this evening.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Deputy Speaker, I rise in sadness really today because I simply have to say to the government I cannot support them tonight, and I just want to make the reasons why that is the case. I want to say to my honourable friend, right honourable friend, as he knows, I supported him enormously in every task that he's had, and I stand behind him on most of these charges. It's difficult. The government faces the most terrible compromises and consequences, and I feel obviously for them, and I want them to succeed. But I do feel that today we are taking arguably the second largest decision that any government has taken since the Second World War. The first one was back in March, the second one is now, and that is to lock down an economy which plunges individuals and people, businesses, into a terrible state of lost jobs. And we're doing it on the basis of Sage's advice on the Friday and Saturday, well, the Friday night, I say, before it was leaked for Saturday. I want to say I thought the leak is appalling. That whoever did it should be sacked, strung up to dry, come here to apologise, grovelled out the door on hands and knees, and beaten on the way out, frankly. Because, to be honest with you, this is appalling, what they have done. It's appalling because what they did was bounce the government. And they bounced the government because I'd like to think that the government would have then spent its time investigating the data that was being presented to them that has now subsequently unravelled in the last few days. I would have loved the government to have looked at this carefully and understood that, for example, when Sage start talking about 4,000 deaths to be reached by December, it's now quite clear that even Professor Whitty has said yesterday, I think all of us would say that the rates would probably be lower than the top peak. I think there's been some rather overblown rhetoric on this. Well, it was their overblown rhetoric, in case he missed the point. And the reality about this is that that figure has turned out to be incorrect. Professor Tim Spector of King's College, London, has said that the rate now is at 1, he believes, falling after some plateauing. And there is good evidence that across the board, the tier system is beginning to work. And I simply say to my right honourable friend, and I'm sorry, by the way, that our right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, wasn't able to stay for our right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, but he must have been busy. But my point is that she was making the point that I want to make now, which is many of these tests, which my right honourable friend has said previously, have been looked at before the tier system has a chance to bite. I thought that what the Prime Minister did back in October when he chose to go for a tier system was brave. It was brave because Sage was arguing for a circuit breaker. By the way, I hate circuit breaker. It's a euphemism that is appalling. It's not a circuit breaker, it's a business breaker. And as the Prime Minister himself said, it's a very, very big decision. And it's a decision that damages lives. And the people that will be damaged by this will be the poorest in society. They will be damaged because they lose their jobs. The loss of a job is not just an income problem. It's self-respect. It's a status. It's what you do. It's how you stand up in front of your family and show them that you are bringing, as it were, the money back to the house and improving their lot. All of these are damaging. And this decision, I believe, was not necessary now. I believe the government can use the circuit, the tier system, to make sure that we do press down on it. And the evidence from all those areas that we have looked at, Liverpool in the northwest, is that we are beginning to see this come down. Further pressure on this, I believe, would work. All the data now that is unravelling, I'm afraid, is unravelling on the basis that now we move to a full lockdown. The damage on the economy is enormous. Can I simply ask my honourable friend this as I close? Can we now please have that economic impact assessment urgently to show what the damage will be to our economy, the livelihoods, the lives, and the people's well-being and mental status? But I will oppose it tonight.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to set out some concerns I have about these regulations, primarily because I believe the economic pain on my constituency will be inflicted on my constituency and the hardship on my constituents. The unintended health consequences of the first lockdown, the government's lack of a plan to deal with the backlog, and then the government's failure of testing, not least because it decided to hand it to the private sector. And I have to remind the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, of the Prime Minister's quote in his response to my right honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, when he said on the 20th of May, we will have a test, track and trace operation that will be world beating, and yes, it will be in place by the 1st of June. The government has introduced 4 changes to the local restrictions for September before the tiered restrictions were introduced and passed in this House on the 13th of September. And don't forget, they were supposed to be reviewed next week on the 11th of November. It did not allow enough time to assess if they were working. It appears they might have been, because we've seen a notable improvements in the rate of infection in Merseyside and Halton. I spoke to my hospitals on a regular basis, and I know they're under a great deal of pressure, and I know what a fantastic job everybody who works there is doing. And I continue to keep an eye on that. The government sets out in its regulations, in the section on vulnerable persons and disability, that the vulnerable people will be any person aged 70 or older, or any person aged under 70 who has underlying health conditions. So if the government believes rightly that it's important to list the meaning of a vulnerable person, but does not set out how it will specifically protect this group, this is quite shocking, given that a group of people make up a significant proportion of patients admitted to hospital with COVID, and this vulnerable group must be better protected to save lives and ease some pressure on our hospitals. They tell me that they simply cannot afford to live on £95.85 a week, and are having to choose between putting their health at risk from COVID or their health at risk from not being able to afford to get the things they need. They are frightened and going to work. This government should be focusing everything possible on this clinically vulnerable group. Instead of sensibly shielding our most vulnerable, why are the government closing businesses that there is no evidence to support are responsible for the spread of COVID? There is no reliable evidence for closure of gyms, stopping golf and tennis, for example. There is no evidence they're responsible for spreading COVID. In coming to its decision, the government does not appear to take into account how many organisations and businesses have invested large amounts of money to become COVID safer. But that was, of course, not the case prior to the first lockdown. And where is the evidence that churches are a significant lift? Constituents tell me going to Mass better helps them. There is no evidence. And we see today in the press reported the ONS figures showing so many more people getting paid below the minimum wage. Many are younger people, low-paid people in the hospitality and service industry. Now, the government, I wrote to the Secretary of State for Health 3 times from April this year to ask him to put Halton forward as an ideal place for mass testing. My requests have been ignored. He now talks about Liverpool. We now know Liverpool is being chosen to be a mass testing area. But although the city region, we are included as that in terms of tier 3 restrictions, we've not been included in the testing. And I asked the Secretary to state why Halton is not been included in the mass testing. Now, there are plenty of people on the waiting lists, Madam Deputy Speaker, who have missed by quite considerable time the 18 weeks target. And that ranges from that range of conditions, when it's cancer and coronary disease, or whether it's gynecology. There are significant numbers of my constituents who have not been seen or been treated in time. And this may mean that some people who have treatable conditions may not be treatable in the future. There is real suffering going on in my constituency, and of course the mental effect on mental health. I cannot support these regulations as they stand, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by apologising for reading a newspaper during the Prime Minister's contribution? He's quite right. However, I wasn't, in my defence, reading my horoscope, even if the Prime Minister very kindly did. I wonder, though, in mitigation, whether I could bring to your attention the headline that I was reading in the Metro this morning, which says vaccine on the front line in a month. And just imagine my excitement at reading that. I hope the Metro is correct, but I would gently point out to the front bench that in the event that it is not correct, in the event that we don't get a game changer soon, we are seriously going to have to think about a plan B. And in the few minutes available to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, I shall explain why I think that is the case. Irrespective of the Prime Minister's kind remarks about my future career prospects, I will be supporting the government this evening. I can't think of a single issue since 2003 that has occupied me quite as much as this, and I've agonised over my choice. I'm going to support the government really because it hinges on one thing for me, and that is that schools are remaining open, something I've discussed with the Secretary of State. In the light of evidence produced by Ackland et al. In Edinburgh, it seems to me it would be foolhardy to close down schools based around deaths to do with COVID, but also the consequentials of such an extraordinary move. It's the right decision to keep them open. It's the right decision to prioritise schools, and it is for that reason that I will be supporting the government this evening. I will also be supporting the government this evening because it seems to me that, broadly speaking, it's doing the same thing that other jurisdictions are doing, and their safety in numbers. I'll be supporting the government this evening too because of the wide margin of uncertainty that attends all of this, and a sense, if I may say so, of some humility in trying to examine all this complicated material and making sense of it. And finally, I should be supporting the government, if I may say so, because I know the Prime Minister, because he shares many of the libertarian instincts that I hold, has pushed back as much as he can on some of the advice that has been given to him. I find that convincing, and that, if I was in any doubt, having analysed the data over the weekend, I would say has pushed me over the line in the decision I have made. But I'm concerned about clarity of data. I'm concerned about the logistics change for the vaccine that the Metro hopes very much will be with us within a month. And the Secretary of State knows I'm concerned because I have some granular evidence from my own constituency that, in fact, those organisations that can provide the wherewithal to guarantee that cold chain necessary for the distribution of the vaccine has not yet been tapped into. And I cite particularly the company Polar in my constituency in that respect, which is a leader in this particular technology and has yet to be contacted. I'm concerned about lack of Plan B. Plan B, Secretary of State, that of course has been made all the more possible by the advent of lateral flow testing technology, which will facilitate, if necessary, focus protection, and we need to give much closer thought to that. I'm concerned about places of collective worship. I'm concerned about sports that are non-contact sports, tennis, golf, and so on. I know that I understand the logic behind proscribing those activities, but we have to treat the British public as adults and individuals with autonomy and agency. And I respectfully disagree with the decisions that have been made on those fronts. And I hope very much, particularly if this sadly has to be continued beyond the beginning of December, that those are looked at again.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been feeling quite emotional today, not just because of the news coming from the US, but because of the gravity of what we are being asked to debate and vote on today. Having only been an MP for 11 months, I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be asked to make a decision like this. I'm horrified by the regulations that I'm being asked to vote for today. I'm horrified by the impact that these restrictions will have on people's lives, their mental health and their livelihoods. I'm horrified by the upward trajectory that we're seeing in infection and hospitalisation rates, and the bleak projections that so many experts have presented to us. And I'm horrified that we're even being put in this position in the first place by a government that I feel has dithered and delayed when we might have had a second, shorter lockdown sooner while schools were closed for half-term to try and get the virus under control. I'm horrified that despite the warnings from the Academy of Medical Sciences that I put to the Secretary of State back in July to address the test and trace system, these warnings were not acted on. And that alongside all these draconian and damaging measures that we are being asked to support today, and indeed which I and my Liberal Democrat colleagues feel we have absolutely no option but to vote through, there is not a shred of evidence that the government is going to use this lockdown time wisely to address the deficiencies in the main weapon that we have until a vaccine comes along, which is to test, trace and isolate every case to keep people safe and to keep our economy going. We hear a lot about testing, but nothing on boosting contact tracing rates by allowing local authorities to lead the tracing as they have so effectively proved they can do, and properly supporting in both practical and financial ways those who need to self-isolate. Even the Prime Minister has finally acknowledged that the sub-20% isolation rates are a major problem. Whilst I and others on this side of the House have been making the case for these measures for some time, I'm pleased that finally Conservative members, not least the former Health Secretary and the Chair of the Select Committee, is now also making the case. So I say to the Secretary of State, if he will not listen to me and those on this side of the House, please listen to him, and for the sake of our country, for people's lives, their well-being and their jobs, please listen and act wisely during these next 4 weeks. There is no shame in changing course and learning from other countries. Finally, on evidence and data, I and my Liberal Democrat colleagues have said repeatedly since the start of the pandemic that sharing the data, the evidence and the government's workings are essential to public trust and compliance when such draconian measures are being put in place. And so I wholeheartedly endorse the comments by the former Prime Minister. I say to the government, publish the impact assessment, show us the scale of the trade-offs that are being made in terms of physical and mental health, jobs lost and damage to the economy. This is not an election campaign. Both sides of the argument must be shared openly and the evidence shared transparently so that members here, and most importantly, the public, can look at the evidence and trust that we are collectively doing the right thing in the nation's interests. And in the few seconds left available to me, I would just also add my support to comments that have been made on both sides of the House about looking again at the regulations around collective acts of worship, publishing the evidence to show whether they are actually a source of infections and outbreaks, and on looking at the non-contact sports, particularly for adults, but also outdoor activities for children and young people. This is critical to people's mental health and their physical well-being.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For months now, for weeks and months, businesses across Greater Manchester and our communities have been subject to restrictions in order to reduce the rate of transmission of coronavirus and enable us to once more get to the position where we can live our lives normally. Towns and cities across the north have been particularly hard hit, and so we must deal with this virus and aim to be in a position at the end of the year where people can spend time with their loved ones again and businesses can have certainty for the future. The effect of the restrictions so far have been hugely difficult for businesses and caused immense strain. But many have been innovative, like Ryan in Cheadle, who transformed his cafe into a greengrocer's to meet local demand. And they've also been willing to start up. This shows how businesses really want to get going, like Inventory in Cheadle a new bar already with rave reviews. And with government assistance, they have kept going, but they are truly worried about the effect that a further month-long lockdown will cause them. However, you will have heard, I know the government has heard the urgings of businesses and people who work in the leisure and hospitality sector and the support that is needed to keep them open. And I welcome the financial measures announced and applaud the measures that these businesses have taken to minimise transmission and operate in a secure, COVID-secure way. However, this is the debate where we're called to balance our economy and our communities and the lives of our constituents. And I believe it will be hard, therefore, for anyone to claim to be unequivocally right in their view or decision. Back in March, we spoke of the pressure on the NHS as the virus raged throughout the continent and reached a critical point here. The NHS remains at the forefront of my mind, as does the health, the lives of my constituents in Cheadle. My local hospital, Stepping Hill, is not yet receiving the numbers of COVID patients in comparison to the peak earlier this year, but it is close. At the height of the first wave, there were 130 coronavirus patients admitted. It's now just 7 less than that at 123. This week, North West Ambulance Service declared a major incident, with ambulances waiting hours outside the hospital, sick people needing to be admitted. Madam Deputy Speaker, a 4-hour wait for an ambulance at a hospital door means that the ambulance crew and paramedics caring for and treating those patients have to work hard. And whilst the ambulance is idle at the hospital, people have to wait for them to attend at home, sometimes having suffered heart attacks and stroke. So hospital pressure always has a knock-on effect, either through ambulance delays or cancelled operations. And for those whose elective surgery has been cancelled, it means many more months of pain and uncertainty with potentially deteriorating conditions. It's essential that we do not let the pressures increase as we enter this difficult winter season. Whatever the decisions we make, there are growing concerns about mental health. For people who have set up their businesses, put their life savings into them, workers who are concerned about their futures, people who are facing and fearful of loneliness, who are missing the socialising with their friends, who cannot go to church and receive the solace and the spirit that they need there, I would ask for this to be considered. I would also ask that a post-COVID mental health strategy be put into place so that after all of this is through, in the new year when hopefully we are in a better position, people know that the charities such as mine, such as the Samaritans and local authorities have got the funding and the packages there to support them, and we must do so too. Thank you.
12 withdrawn, so Philip Davis.
We were told, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the reason for the first national lockdown was to give time to build capacity in the NHS, presumably so we wouldn't need any further lockdowns. So what has the Secretary of State been doing? Why has he failed in this task? Well, we know what he's been doing. Instead of building that capacity and sorting out test and trace properly, he has been spending far too much of his time seemingly relishing the power of seeking to micromanage every aspect of everybody's lives. It's perfectly clear that lockdowns don't even work. They don't save lives, they merely spread them out over a longer period of time. But lockdowns do cost lives, as well as livelihoods, not to mention the other health implications of collapsing the economy, in particular the effect on people's mental health. If lockdowns and blizzards of arbitrary rules were the solution to this problem, we would have solved it months ago. We have not been short on version after version of senseless, arbitrary rules which have no scientific basis behind them at all. There has been a new set of rules virtually every single week, and yet the government still persists with this failed strategy. People are not stupid. They can see that the rules do not make any sense, and that is why they, like me, no longer have any faith in the people at the Department of Health and Public Health England who are making these decisions. I asked the Prime Minister earlier this week how many collapsed businesses and how many job losses he and his government believe are a price worth paying for pursuing this strategy. I don't think I got an answer. So perhaps the Secretary of State can answer that question today. How many job losses would it take before the Secretary of State accepted that we needed a different strategy? How many jobs is he prepared to sacrifice to keep on with this policy of lockdowns and arbitrary restrictions? 2 million? 4 million? 6 million? People would like to know how many house repossessions is he prepared to see to keep doing this same strategy? And that gets down to the nub of this, Madam Deputy Speaker. Those people, like the Secretary of State, like the people at Public Health England, they're not offering to sacrifice their own jobs to pursue this strategy. Nobody voting for this motion tonight is offering to sacrifice their own job in order to pursue this lockdown policy. Of course not. They're just expecting millions of others in our country to sacrifice their jobs to pursue this policy. Nobody voting for this motion tonight is offering to give up 20% of their salary or forego all of their income completely, as so many in our country are being expected to do. Oh goodness me, no, Madam Deputy Speaker. Those sacrifices are just conveniently being expected of everyone else. Madam Deputy Speaker, it stinks. I would at least have some respect for those voting for this motion and for the Secretary of State if he offered to sacrifice his job in solidarity with all the others in the country he is expecting to do the same. But there's no chance of that. No wonder so many people have no faith in politicians. No wonder so many people feel there is one rule for us and one rule for them. I never thought, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would see the day a so-called Conservative minister would stand up and urge Parliament to further sacrifice our most basic of freedoms, collapse the economy and destroy jobs, all to pursue a failed strategy. As a Conservative, Madam Deputy Speaker, whatever the problem, collapsing the economy and destroying people's jobs and livelihoods can never be the right solution.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government has repeatedly failed to listen to the voices of people on the front line in this pandemic and to our community's fears of the impact of COVID. The centralisation and handing of the response of this government to the private sector has been catastrophic and will go down in history as such. My fear, once again, is can a government ideologically hell-bent on using the pandemic as a testing bed for the promotion of the private sector over public services listen and learn from its failings on the eve of another national lockdown? In Liverpool West Derby, the community and mutual aid groups have had to step in where the government and its friends in private companies like Serco have failed us all. In the first lockdown, the community in Liverpool came together to form mutual aid hubs because of these failings. We distributed 48,000 visors, 37,000 masks, thousands of aprons and scrubs to frontline workers. Workers who've been left without PPE by the government. Fan supporting food banks and North Liverpool food banks distributed thousands of food parcels to families and people in our community, often shielding, who've been left without adequate financial support by the government. In Liverpool, it was evident back in September that the pressure on hospitals was increasing due to the steep rise in COVID-19 cases. Liverpool's mayor, and following that, the leader of the opposition, called for a circuit breaker lockdown, which would have been timed alongside the school holidays. This would have relieved pressure on our health and social care services, and it would have saved lives, but tragically, it fell on deaf ears once again. The challenges facing our communities will be even greater over the winter, and will not be helped by this government, for example, refusing to provide free school meals over the holidays or refusing to reinstate measures such as the eviction ban. Can the Secretary of State guarantee that he will now start to listen and the lessons have been learned from the failings of the first lockdown? Will he finally start prioritising our public services over the interests of private companies who have a track record of failure? And will he finally start listening to the people in communities who have been hardest hit by this pandemic?
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are being asked today to take away the fundamental freedoms of nearly 68 million people in this country. And I would like, first of all, to thank Mr. Speaker for his strenuous efforts successfully in persuading the government that we should have 3 hours debate on this, not 90 minutes. But can I just say that 3 hours debate on such a massive intervention taking away liberty shows how little we value the liberty of our constituents. It isn't good enough. It should have been at least a day of debate before we took such extreme action. I have to give way.
put on the record that it's probably only thanks to him that we're having this debate at all in advance of the measures coming into force.
My honourable friend is too kind, but I'm grateful to him. I would say that I fully accept the sincerity of the Prime Minister, the sincerity of the Secretary of State in bringing forward the measures that they are, and their belief that they are doing the right thing. Nonetheless, I have to say that in over 23 years as a member of this House, when I vote against this motion tonight, I will do so with greater conviction than I have in casting any vote in those 23 years. Other members have commented on the paucity of information and proper data presented to the House, the fact that we have been asking for the proper impact assessment that gives both sides of the account. That's not only important for us in this House to be able to make a balanced judgment, crucially, it should be there. It should be the basis on which the government had made its judgment. So why it is not possible to publish that impact assessment, I think should be deeply troubling for all of us. I want to say a word, Madam Deputy Speaker, about a particular sector which is very important for my constituency, the aviation sector, which, after being decimated by the first lockdown and by an absurdly long period of quarantine without airport testing introduced to reduce that quarantine, it has been decimated over a period of several months. Just as they were looking forward to the introduction in the next few weeks of an airport testing regime, instead, for the second time this year, the sector has been effectively closed by the government. Businesses like supermarkets have enjoyed record profits, but also have enjoyed rates relief during this period. Airports and airlines have been reduced to zero revenue again, and it is essential that they are given proper support, or they simply won't be there when we come through this crisis, and are looking to them to resume a very successful British industry over the years. But I want in my last 2 minutes, Madam Deputy Speaker, to raise a more fundamental question, because I want to ask whether some of these measures that the government is taking, whether the government actually has any right to take those measures. Because the thing that troubles me most is that the government is reaching too far into the private and family lives of our constituents. I think there is an unintended, perhaps, but an arrogance in assuming that government has the right to do so, that it has the right to tell people whether they can visit their elderly parents in a care home, whether it has the right to tell parents that they can't see their children or their grandchildren, whether it has any right, for heaven's sake, to tell consenting adults with whom they are allowed to sleep. Does it have the right to ban acts of collective worship? And I'm glad that at this point the churches are standing up against this and are objecting, because earlier in the year I thought they possibly went a little too quietly. And any right, for heaven's sake, to ban golf or tennis without giving any reason whatsoever. When the Prime Minister was challenged on this on Monday, he simply said, well, if you start to give exemptions, the whole thing will unravel. We cannot vote for measures on that flimsy basis. We cannot ask people to follow rules which patently make no sense and expect them to have respect for what is being done. So I have a fundamental problem with much of what we're being asked to do here, as well as the economic impact, the human toll which this will have. And I can't be the only member, I'll close with this thought, I can't be the only member of this House who has sat in a constituency surgery with a constituent in tears as they have said that they can't see a vulnerable elderly parent with dementia in a care home. We mustn't do it.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the near crisis point in the capacity and the ability of the NHS to cope with rising cases and hospital admissions across the country, I believe that action is necessary. I am, however, at a loss as to why the government has acted so late. This has led to more cases and ultimately more deaths, and means that we now need a longer lockdown, which will have a huge human and economic cost. For weeks we have seen the evidence pointing to a growing second wave of the virus, not just in areas like Bradford, which has been subject to restrictions for months, but right across the country. I know these are difficult decisions for the government to make, but weeks ago, the Leader of the Opposition called for a circuit breaker lockdown, in line with sage advice, which the government then chose not to just ignore, but to also ridicule. Had it been enacted then, this short lockdown, coinciding with half-term, could have put a brake on the virus at a critical moment. Some of the pain and hardship that we are now facing would have been spared. Now we are facing a potentially open-ended lockdown, with ministers unable to confirm when this will end. Businesses will be shut for longer, families will be separated, mental and physical health will suffer. The economic cost and the social cost of lockdown has been made worse by the government's failure to act earlier. In West Yorkshire, things have been even more chaotic. The government announced last Thursday that our region would go into Tier 3 from the following Monday. At that point, ministers repeatedly denied that the country was facing a national lockdown. Businesses and families across the region began to prepare for the new restrictions. Yet the very next day, the national lockdown was leaked to the press, and it was announced that West Yorkshire would stay in Tier 2 until the lockdown. Over recent weeks, the government has treated the people of the North with utter contempt, and this is just the latest example of a long and sorry saga. The government must commit to honouring the financial commitment they made to the people and businesses of West Yorkshire when the Tier 3 agreement was made. Now, turning to a couple of very specific points. The government needs to plan and deal with social isolation and loneliness, in particular amongst older people and those with caring responsibilities. So many of my constituents across many faiths have asked me to tell the government and the Prime Minister that collective acts of worship are essential and should not be made illegal by any government. They are an essential part of their faith and an essential part of their lives, and I ask the government to reconsider the ban on collective worship. And the government should also look at how gyms and other sports facilities can be reopened safely. Again, this is essential for maintaining mental and physical health through these long and difficult winter months. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government needs a plan for getting out of this lockdown and dealing with the economic consequences. The lack of an impact assessment for these regulations and the subsequent cost to jobs and businesses is simply neglectful, because areas like Bradford will suffer the most if at the end of the lockdown we return to a new set of local restrictions where many businesses will just simply not survive. There needs to be an absolute focus in government on saving and creating jobs, because without this the consequences for my constituents will be devastating. So I say to the government, do not waste this time, use it to get a grip on the virus and begin planning for our economic recovery. A failure to do so will lead to a prolonging of the lockdown and all the human, social and economic harm that that brings. Thank you.
Sir Charles Walker.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is lovely to see you in the chair. Madam Deputy Speaker, our freedoms are like the air we breathe. They're fundamental to us as a nation and to who we are as its people. Yet once again we stand on the threshold of using the rule of law to undermine the rule of law, the foundations of which have been laid over centuries. And can I say this, Madam Deputy Speaker? We are not asking our constituents to do anything we have never asked. We have coerced them. We have coerced them through criminal and civil law. Let us not use that word ask, because it is not an accurate description of what we have done. We have criminalised freedom of association, the freedom to go about one's business, the freedom to travel, and the freedom to protest. The freedom to protest. That is the oxygen of democracy. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this hurts my head and it hurts my heart. And dismissing these sincerely held concerns as wanting to let the virus rip is both deeply ungenerous and deeply, deeply unkind.
But in responding to that charge, Madam Deputy Speaker, I say, if this Parliament is not the place for disputation, delectable or otherwise, where is this rigour to be found? And I want people to live long lives, full lives, happy lives, myself included. But my mortality, our mortality, is ultimately our contract with our Maker, whereas our fundamental rights are our contract with government. So I will not be supporting this legislation. I think it is terribly unjust and, like my dear friend, in many parts cruel. I will have no part of criminalising parents for seeing their children and children for seeing their parents. No part. This legislation goes against my every instinct, perhaps an instinct even more fundamental than the love and touch of my family. And I am not living in fear of the virus. I will not live in fear of the virus, but I am living in fear of something much darker, hiding in the shadows. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, when the sunlight returns, and it will return, I hope it chases those shadows away. But I can't be sure that it will. I cannot be sure. And that is at the heart of my anxiety and the anxiety of so many of the people I represent in this place. Thank you.
Matt Ruddle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be able to contribute this afternoon. Madam Deputy Speaker, we now undoubtedly face a very difficult and indeed challenging situation, and I support the government's approach. Cases of the virus are doubling every few days, and the sheer pace of growth now, it's quite clearly, will outstrip the capacity of the NHS to respond. We cannot ignore the very serious position we now face. These measures, however difficult, are necessary, and indeed other options such as the tiered system have quite clearly now failed. However, although these measures are difficult, they are necessary. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would seek to first pay tribute to all of those who are contributing so bravely in the NHS and other services, our care workers, our NHS workers, key workers, volunteers, and indeed other members of the community. This bravery and determination is impressive, and it's being demonstrated by people who've been through this once already this year, and indeed, in some cases, during the summer and the early autumn as well. I would like to, however, raise a series of very specific points, which I hope the Minister will be able to respond to later. First and foremost, it would have been so much better if the government had acted sooner. The numbers were quite clear, and as my right honourable friend mentioned earlier from the dispatch box, if this action had been taken sooner, lives would have been saved, and indeed the economy protected, and it is worth reflecting on that, and I do hope ministers will reflect quite deeply on this issue and on the delay, which has been so unfortunate. There are a series of specific points I would like to raise, though. First and foremost, I would hope that the Secretary of State for Health will look into this matter. We must fix the test and trace system. It's quite apparent that it is currently failing. There's a low rate of test and trace carrying on compared with the need. In my own area, we've seen some very serious problems, delays to facilities coming to Reading and Woodley. We've also seen a very unfortunate incident in a care home, and I would ask him to look again at whether it's possible to have much greater capacity for testing in care homes, where people are so clearly vulnerable at this particularly vulnerable at this time, and indeed also to look at the scope for testing, far greater testing across the health and care system, perhaps looking in much greater detail at the scope for testing home visiting staff. I've had constituents raise that with me in some great concern, actually, elderly, vulnerable residents who would be reassured if there was more capacity for testing visitors coming to their homes. There are, however, a number of other measures which I hope the government as a whole will look into. These are mainly economic and social measures, and other members have raised these today. I would particularly like to mention the concerns of many self-employed people. I realise that members across the House share this issue. One person said to me only today, in fact, I have paid in all my life by tax and through the national insurance system and now at a time of great need, I'm not able to get anything back. I do hope that the government can look at the loopholes in the measures that they've currently taken and reconsider them and understand that there are people who are potentially missing out on support at this difficult time. I do appreciate that they are reviewing some of this. I would also urge them to look across sectors in the economy, not just the most visible end of those sectors. So, for example, in the hospitality sector, measures have been taken to support pubs. It's right that they should be supported. Across the supply chain, though, and other dependent businesses, there's been much less support, and it's very important that ministers remember this and take further action to look at the whole supply chains and whole sectors and understand that a wide range of businesses are under pressure at this difficult time. Finally, I would just like to very briefly mention that I agree wholeheartedly with my right honourable friends and other concerns that have been raised across the House about the importance of people being able to worship, and I do hope this will be reviewed, and indeed that sport and the contribution it plays to our society, the value it has for children and for people's mental health is reconsidered. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Prior to this debate, I've been contacted by many constituents with their opinions on how to vote today. My default position would be to support those who wish for fewer restrictions, to allow others to live their lives as they choose to do, to help and support each and every constituent in that choice. However, this is an unprecedented situation, and the first duty of any government must be to protect its citizens. I know that the government, and especially the Prime Minister, has not taken any of these difficult decisions lightly. I have supported and will continue to support the tiered structure and the ability to be able to look at a very local level and understand what is going on in each locality. It has enabled some of the country to remain with a very low level of restriction for an extended period. However, in order to prevent a deluge of intensive care beds needed, I come to the conclusion that we must have a heightened restriction to our liberty throughout November to stem the tide of this virus. This is not to say that our constituents have not followed the rules. I would like to thank the people of Loughborough constituency, residents, visitors, students and pupils alike, who have very clearly followed the rules, which has not only helped themselves, but also their friends and neighbours. This is a hard task ahead for many during November. There are a number of religious festivals and commemorations which in other years have attracted huge crowds and gatherings, such as Diwali, Advent, the birthday of Guru Nanak. These are often times when families get together to celebrate their faith. This will not be possible in private homes this year, but I would still press that churches and places of worship should be allowed to open for those specific events to support their communities. Loughborough usually has a large and very moving remembrance service in Queen's Park, along with others in Shepshed and surrounding villages. Again, these will not be able to happen in the same way this year, but this does not diminish our need to honour our fallen. We will remember them. My friends and colleagues and those who live in Loughborough constituency will know that I have been going on, as they would put it, about a V-shaped recovery for a long time. We owe it to those who have lost their lives to ensure that we come back stronger and better as a country and as a constituency. We have capitalised on all the support from the government in Loughborough, the grants and support for small businesses, the loans that have been available to keep businesses going, the individual support for those who have found themselves in a difficult situation, and programmes such as Eat Out to Help Out, Kickstart in particular, and the early town deal funding have all supported the local community. I welcome that this support package has been extended to ensure that there remains a safety net for those who need it. So, let's get ready for the time these new restrictions will ease. Let us take this time to plan, each individual, each family, each business, each organisation. Let every one of us make a positive decision to create a good recovery for ourselves, our local communities and our businesses. Risk assessment is the key to this. With risk, you eradicate if you can and you mitigate where you can't. This is a global pandemic. We cannot eradicate, so we must mitigate. As part of the planning process, we should therefore be looking at taking a different approach to events and venues to produce their own risk assessments on how many people they can safely accommodate whilst adhering to social distancing guidelines. Let's spend this month making sure each of us has a plan to get on in life. Let's turn the negative into a positive and all take part in the recovery of this great country.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many honourable members, I'd like to start by paying tribute to all of the British public, including those in my Aberavon constituency, who've shown such resilience and fortitude throughout an extremely difficult 2020. Madam Deputy Speaker, these new restrictions are of course for the people of England, but the economic package accompanying them will of course have a significant effect on Wales and on my Aberavon constituents. Regrettably, it's become all too evident that the Prime Minister and Chancellor only took decisive action in terms of economic support once London and parts of the South East were put into Tier 2 and then full lockdown. When we in Wales went into our firebreaker, the UK government refused to extend furlough. When the north of England went into Tier 3, the government refused to extend furlough. Now, with new restrictions affecting the South East, the money suddenly appears, as if by magic. Madam Deputy Speaker, furlough must be fair for all. It's as simple as that. During his successful general election campaign, the Prime Minister promised to level up the UK. In reality, the very opposite has happened. This virus has turned the gap between the South East and the rest of the UK into a chasm. We now need a clear and specific plan that states what levelling up is actually supposed to mean in practice. And this plan must have our steel industry at its heart. A focus on steel would deliver three interlinked benefits. First, it would support the creation of high-skill, well-paid jobs in areas of the UK that have been ignored by successive Conservative governments since 2010, including in South Wales. Second, it would strengthen the UK's sovereign capability. One of the most important lessons of the pandemic is that we are far too dependent on supply chains from other countries, and increasingly those countries are run by authoritarian governments who are not our natural allies. And third, it would enable our transition to net zero, backing the industries of the future, but also greening current industries. Yet by failing to provide the UK's largest steelmaker and the employer of 4,000 steel workers in my constituency with the emergency loans during the pandemic to plug the cash flow gap caused by the fall in demand, the government has once again chosen to sit on its hands. Madam Deputy Speaker, there can be no post-pandemic recovery, no levelling up, and no modern manufacturing renaissance without a strong and healthy steel industry. If I could just end by saying a few words on test, track and trace. While Welsh Labour backed local experts and our local authorities, this UK government has put test, track and trace in the hands of Serco without any proper tendering process. Serco won huge contracts to the tune of £500 million and, through no fault of the vast majority of their employees, I might add, utterly failed our country at this time of need. The choice that this government has taken is to privatise and centralise, when what it should have been doing is keeping what is a truly public function in the public sector and allowing local authorities to mobilise the expertise that they have on the ground. So I hope that this UK government will look to Cardiff Bay, will look to the Welsh government, will learn the lessons of test and trace and take this 4-week lockdown as an opportunity to fix the system and to learn from the way in which the Welsh government has done it. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Order. I'll be moving straight to the Right Honourable Member for the Forest of Dean, but after Mr Harper has spoken, I will reduce the time limit to 3 minutes in order to try to accommodate as many colleagues as possible. Mark Harper.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, and you will have indicated from my intervention on the Prime Minister earlier that for only the second time in my 15 years in Parliament, I'm not able to support my front bench. And you will know from our shared endeavours through our experience in usual channels that it's not easy for a former Chief Whip to not support their party, but I do so for the following reasons. I very strongly supported the tiered approach. My part of the world, which I'm here to represent, has a very low level of virus, and my constituents have been working incredibly hard, businesses and individuals, to keep the virus under control. And there's a very low level of prevalence, not just across the community, but actually particularly amongst those who are over 60, where the level of virus remains low and over the last few weeks has been flat or falling. And certainly in conversation with my Directors of Public Health and my local NHS, no concerns have been raised about the NHS being overwhelmed. That was my starting position. I listened very carefully to what the Prime Minister set out in his press conference on Saturday. And I looked yesterday at the data that was published. But there are several flaws with that data, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, the modelling that's taken place about the number of deaths is old data, and we already know. My right honourable friend, the right honourable member for Maidenhead, set this out very clearly. We already know that the most extreme of those models is wrong. It's predicted things for dates that have already passed, and it's been wrong by a factor of 4 or 5. The second thing we know is that the modelling that SAGE has undertaken doesn't take into account, and it's set out very clearly in documents published yesterday, does not take into account the introduction of the tiered system over the last couple of weeks. So therefore, all the modelling just doesn't take into account the fact that over half of the country has been placed under Tier 2 or Tier 3 restrictions. And we know from the information published just yesterday by Steve Rotherham, the Mayor of the Liverpool City region, that region, which was the first region placed in Tier 3 restrictions, has seen quite a significant reduction in virus across all of the region, all of the parts of that region. And of course, it's that data from SAGE that's been fed into the National Health Service, and all of the modelling done by the NHS about its capacity has been based on that SAGE modelling. So if that modelling is wrong, as I believe it is, then the NHS forecasts are wrong. And it was very interesting, one of the leaked slides last week, which showed the capacity of the NHS being exhausted in the next few weeks, interestingly was not used in the presentation by the Prime Minister at the press conference, and no data has been published to substantiate it. And that's because if you look at it, according to that slide, the South West Hospital capacity should have been exceeded already, and it has not, and it is nowhere near being exceeded. And I simply, therefore, don't believe the government has made the case. The one further reason for myself is that these regulations also give the power to use reasonable force to enforce them to officers of the state who are not trained to safely use that power. The Secretary of State knows I've raised this on the floor of the House and with him and with his ministers, and I had understood there was a review to be taken place to remove it. That power should only be used by police officers who are properly trained to safely use it. For those reasons, I'm unable to support the government and will be voting against the regulations later today.
Tim Farron.
Deputy Speaker, my communities in South Cumbria, in the Lakes and the Dales, arguably the worst hit on both counts in terms of our vulnerability economically, with 40% of our entire workforce on furlough at one stage, a 6-fold increase in unemployment, and then on the other hand, with an age profile 10 years above the national average, the vulnerability and the potential for fatality in the face of the virus is great. At the same time, we're seeing huge pressure on our local health service, which has done a stunning job over the last 7-8 months, making personal sacrifices in every single department. We see the beginning of signs of being overwhelmed by the virus at this period. Just in the last few days, the North West Ambulance Service urging no one to call 999 unless their call was for a life-threatening emergency. So this is what the government is seeking to prevent, and the greatest threat to our liberty is a threat to our right to life and our access to medical services, which are threatened to be overwhelmed if action isn't taken. Having said that, I am deeply critical of some of the government's approach on this issue, not least on some of the economic areas where there's been a blind spot when it comes to 3 million people, we believe, who have been excluded from any kind of support whatsoever. I think of people who have been self-employed for 18 months or so in my constituency. I think of people running small limited companies, taxi drivers, personal trainers, hairdressers, getting absolutely nothing for 7 or 8 months, or people who just happened to be on the payroll just a day or two too late earlier this spring. Those people who are the backbone of our economy, the entrepreneurs that we need to drive the recovery when eventually it comes, those people left in deep and desperate debt, not sure if they can afford to put food on the table for their children or pay to keep a roof over their heads. The government must act, and must act now, to help those who have been excluded. I also point out that a third of those who are excluded are private renters. Now, the government immediately and rightly extended mortgage holidays for those who are lucky enough to own their own homes. Not a thing for renters in the last few days or weeks. And that is why this is a moment, surely, for the government to rush through some other legislation, and that is to suspend Section 8 rent arrears and Section 21 no-fault evictions, and to up the local housing allowance so people can afford to pay their rent. It is essential that we protect the lives and well-beings of all of our constituents and protect them from hardship. And it is above all important that we protect them from the potential of homelessness and indeed destitution. A final word is this, that on the news about the furlough, we're told that people who were laid off prior to the 23rd of September will not be furloughed. I can tell you there are thousands of people in the tourism industry that were laid off because of the hardship that industry is facing. I asked for a package for hospitality and tourism that backdates that further back than the 23rd of September this year and provides a package of support right the way through to March and to the Easter holidays next year.
Salou.
34 years ago, as an otherwise fit and healthy 24-year-old, I was carried out of my home by an ambulance crew with a collapsed lung. I had an emergency operation in the middle of the night. I was frightened, I was worried, I was concerned about many things. Would I live? What would be the impact on my health for the rest of my life? But the one thing I wasn't worried about was that there would be a hospital bed for me. Yesterday, in England, 10,971 COVID patients were in our hospitals. That is an increase of 2,376 on the last week. That's an increase of over a fifth. My own hospital, the Luton and Dunstable, tells me that they have much less spare capacity at the moment than they did in April and May during the first lockdown. So the margin for error is very, very small. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are no good choices before any of us. We are being asked to do a horrendous thing today. The impact on jobs, the impact on businesses, the loss of our freedoms, which every one of us who will support the government tonight cherishes just as much as those who will not, are awful things for us to have to do. But against that, we must set lives lost, hospitals turning people away, the lack of treatment for people who are ill or who've had terrible accidents. And I cannot, in all conscience, vote for anything or not support a measure that would allow that situation to happen. I wish this motion was amendable. I think there are things we could do on safe care home visits. As the Second Church Estates Commissioner, of course, I am concerned about the lack of collective worship, and I would say churches have been some of the safest places I have been in recent weeks. I'm concerned about businesses with bills they can't pay. I'm concerned about the events industry, which just somehow seems to have fallen outside so many of the support packages. Whipsnade Zoo in my constituency is a full 600 acres. It can't open, but Kew can. Why not just close the indoor elements of zoos and allow the outdoor to go, to welcome people? Let's make sure we have click and collect for small shops, small independent shops, people doing their Christmas shopping, so they don't lose out, so people can shop safely come the 3rd of December and not have big queues. And let's make sure we don't have huge New Year's Eve crowd celebrations. The most important thing I want to say, though, is enforcement. It's not explaining and educating. The police, councils, shops themselves must do more about people not wearing masks in shops. People should wear masks at work, and it's terrible that only 8 out of 10 people are self-isolating properly. This is a shared responsibility for all of us.
Craig McKinley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can fully understand
the lure of the precautionary principle that the government has been faced with dreadful scenarios and increasing cases and projections. I can understand that lure of let's do this just in case, let's take no chances, and I certainly do not envy the Prime Minister or any of the Quad Group for their decision. But I have a number of concerns that simply cannot be overcome. Let us cast our mind forward to the 2nd of December, because I feel we're going to be here again. What will good enough look like that we can unwind? It took 3.5 months last time for us to have a haircut or have our first pint in a pub. What will be the level of daily infections or hospitalisations that are deemed good enough to unwind? Now, I think this is a mistake by the government for not considering what those figures might be, because it would at least give the public something to aim for and something to look forward to. We've got no concept, no data as to what that is likely to be. We're told that this is the last bridge before the cavalry come over the hill, that we have better treatments and we have that vaccine that we're all looking for. But we don't know when that vaccine is going to be ready. We don't know how effective it's going to be. We don't know the time frame over which it can be rolled out across the population. And let us not forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, HIV has been with us for 40 years and we still do not have a vaccine. We have so many clear nonsenses within the regulations. I and many others in this House, I'm sure, are getting emails from gym owners and users. I've had them from people who enjoy outdoor archery, and obviously the golf situation, and a lot from churchgoers. How can it be sensible for a couple to go for a walk on the golf club that they belong to, but they face a fine if they dare do it with a golf club and a ball? And of course, please.
The honourable friend for giving way. Has he received, as I have, a letter signed by 1,500 church organisation managers and ministers and people of religion opposing these regulations and asking why on earth is the government closing churches in the way that they're doing?
I think it has to be an overwhelming number of the responses I've had are from churchgoers, and I'll just develop that point very briefly. Congregations that go to churches, to synagogues, to mosques, to temples, these are adherent, sensible, disciplined people. To treat them as anything but, I'm afraid, is nothing but an insult. Now, just a few weeks ago, we were offered the tiered system, and that was supported by this House. It was deemed to be the new holy grail that we can look to. And Liverpool, under Tier 3, seems to be having results. We simply have not given enough time for those opportunities to bed in. But in Kent, in South Fandon, in my constituency, we're currently under Tier 1. What will all this mean to those businesses who've invested heavily in COVID-friendly and secure facilities? The businesses and the pubs. We've already seen flip-flopping under the earlish published proposals that off-sales and microbreweries can now continue selling beer outside. Whereas always the supermarkets could have sold as much as they like. This, I'm afraid, is at the heart of muddled thinking. I want to develop, just very briefly, what I want to call the Wilkinson's conundrum. A great store on every high street. How can it be that they can continue to sell essential and non-essential, and yet the independent shop next door that sells just some of that non-essential stuff that Wilkinson's can continue to sell will be illegal for them to continue? I'm being asked to spend £50 billion extra today, or perhaps even more. There is no data as to what this means on other health issues. There is no assessment of what this means to families not able to see grandchildren or to see off loved ones in their final days. I'm here to make a decision. I will not be abstaining. I'm paid to have a view. And tonight I will be voting against this. I'm sorry.
Order. I would just like to gently point out that not everybody is going to get in on this debate. At this stage, if interventions are taken, particularly from people who are not on the speaking list, it will prevent others from speaking. Sir Edward Lee.
If we're going to defeat this virus, the public have to have confidence in the government. They have to know that everything the government does is based not on opinion polls, but on evidence. Modelling is not evidence. Scientific fact is evidence. And there's been too many chopping and changing of government policy encouraging us to eat out, to help out, to get back the offices in September, then stay away from offices. So base everything on evidence. And I've got so little time, I want to mention one point where evidence is all important. The leaders of all the faith communities have written to the Prime Minister demanding evidence of how it is that people attending church services are spreading COVID. There is no evidence. I know there's no evidence. The Chief Scientific Advisor of the government has confirmed there is no evidence. Everybody knows if they go to their local church or indeed to their mosque that mask wearing is enforced, social distancing is enforced. Even in mosques, my friends tell me people are bringing their own prayer mats. There is no evidence for this ban. The ban comes because the government says if we're going to stop people going to pubs, then we had to stop people going to churches or mosques or synagogues. There is no evidence. However, I intervened on the Prime Minister on a couple of days ago. He assured me that this was only a temporary ban on religious services. The Prime Minister took the trouble to come up to me before this debate and said, Edward, we're going to get churches open. I said, when? He said, soon. I understand contacts are taking place with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of Westminster to try and get the churches open as soon as possible. On that basis, and on that basis only, that this is a temporary measure and that the government will provide evidence and the churches will open on the 2nd of December, on that basis I am prepared to vote for this measure tonight. On that basis and on that promise. Because it is a fundamental human right in any society. We are signatories to the Convention of Human Rights. It is a fundamental human right for people to be able to go to communal worship. And for religious people, you can't just tell them that, okay, sometime in the future, you'll be able to go to religious service. That's not good enough for them. They want to be able to have that communal worship and to have it now. So the government, and I'm looking at the Health Secretary, it's not good enough just to say that we're all in this together because we're stopping people playing golf or we're stopping people going to bars, that yes, religious people have to be under the same restrictions. Provide the evidence. And I've received this assurance that these churches, these synagogues, these mosques are going to open before the 2nd of December, or at least by the 2nd of December. And on that basis, and on that basis only, I will vote for the government.
Hines.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And this is, of course, the eventuality that we all had hoped to evolve. And I personally hate even contemplating curtailment of freedoms in the way that our right honourable friend for Altrincham and Sale West set out. But no responsible government could sidestep what it is faced with. We use this word a lot now in the last few days, the overwhelming of the National Health Service. It is worth just stopping to dwell and think about what that actually means in practice, as our friend from South West Bedfordshire outlined. It means people who need other essential treatments just not being able to get them in the way that we have come to expect. We will always be able to rely on the National Health Service. And of course this time, unlike the previous lockdown, we are approaching winter with all the stresses and strains on the National Health Service that brings in any case. This is a global pandemic, but quite often we speak about it as if we were the only country involved. In fact, every one of the 5 major countries of Western Europe had a steep rise in COVID cases during the course of October, and now there are new restrictions coming across the continent. Perhaps most notably in France and Germany, the other 2 large economies of Europe, with very different political traditions, different health systems, different experiences with test and trace. Both of those, like us, sought to exhaust the possibilities of a localised and a regional approach, and now are returning once again to a national programme. It is true that in different parts of our country there are different rates of prevalence of this virus, but the trend is upwards pretty much everywhere, with the rate above 1. And as the Prime Minister outlined earlier, of course, you know, when one hospital gets full, they move patients on to another hospital. Staff have to move on in order to shore up the system. Ultimately, we are one nation and we have one national health service. Now, this lockdown is not going to be the same as the previous one, in particular because education will remain fully open. And I really want to thank the government and welcome that approach. And I acknowledge that to prioritise schooling, that does involve some trade-offs. And therefore you have to acknowledge that any time that people get together, there is a risk of transmission of this virus. But I would ask for special reconsideration in two areas. One is about non-contact outdoor sports, and the second, as so many colleagues, others have mentioned, is about religious services. So obviously not everyone has faith, but for some that do, the solace that they receive from attending church or another place of worship with other people is as important for their mental health as other mental health services, which we rightly prioritise and will keep going come what may. I welcome the business support, and I hope government will also use this time to make sure there are medium-term support packages for the most affected sectors. Nobody wants to be doing this, but I will be backing these measures this evening.
Martin Oakley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Huntingdonshire, as of last Friday, we had a very low and stable figure of 58 cases per 100,000, and about half a dozen hospital beds in Hinchinbrook Hospital were occupied by COVID patients. In effect, without lockdown, we would have remained at Tier 1 status. This is of great credit to the caution and sensible behaviour shown by residents locally, and also reflects the excellent local public services and council provision that I'm seeing. If I was to support these further massive restrictions on our liberty and democracy, I would need not only more evidence of their chances of success than I've received to date, but also an understanding as to why Cambridgeshire should be treated in exactly the same way as high-risk areas in the country. One well-respected local family business of some 40 years standing has just contacted me to say that they will not be able to stand a further lockdown. The majority of local businesses I speak to have already made redundancies and now dread for their futures. Huntingdonshire has one of the highest proportions of small business ownership in the country, typically without the capital reserves of large corporations. These businesses have done everything they can to stay afloat through finding new markets, through taking up government loans and furlough schemes, and general twisting and turning to do anything and everything to keep their businesses alive. And I have been incredibly impressed by the resilience and resourcefulness of these local businesses, and they frankly deserve more than for me to tell them that I have voted for a further lockdown given our low local COVID rate and the national lack of evidence. Our local health workers, carers, volunteers have also done a magnificent job, and many lessons have now been learnt that should improve health and care provision with the second wave of the virus. Yes, of course, we need to save the NHS, but this cannot be at the cost of wiping out the economy, without which there will be no money to pay for the NHS. The problem is that we're not getting a weighted assessment of the health costs in the context of all the other costs. When the Allied forces planned D-Day, an assessment of the human and material costs were drawn up before deciding to invade. It would be wrong to say that Churchill and the generals failed to show humanity in their assessment of likely casualties, but they weighed this up against the strategic objective of retaining a democratic European continent. And we now roll from one lockdown to another with no vaccine and no effective track and trace system. We need urgently to consider our weighted strategy, our objectives here, accepting that whatever happens, lockdown or no lockdown, we are ultimately going to have to learn to live with this virus.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are three questions here. How did we get into this situation? What do we do about it now? And how do we find our way out of it? And much has been said about whether we should have done this or other things earlier, and when the crisis has passed, then there should be a full and detailed examination of decision-making in response to this pandemic. When the time comes for that, I will fully support it, but that time is not now, and we have more immediate questions to answer. And this House has to take decisions today on the basis of where we are, not on where we wish we were. And we have to make those decisions, as so often, on the basis of imperfect information and in the knowledge that all our options will harm someone. And I respect the fact that different members of this House can, for good and decent reasons, come to different conclusions on that. And I don't dispute for a moment the human and financial cost of these measures. But it seems to me that the preponderance of the scientific evidence that we have seen is telling us that if we do not take a decision with damaging consequences, we face an outcome with devastating consequences. And for that reason, I will support these measures today. At times of threat, we act to protect the most vulnerable members of our society, even when it hurts the rest of us. That is who we are as a nation, and whatever else this pandemic changes, it must not change that. But the government's job is not just to react, but also to plan for the future. And on this, I have to say, I do not think the government has said enough. We must now accept the need to live with this virus in the longer term. And it's simply impossible for businesses or individuals to manage their lives if we are to find ourselves continually and unpredictably in and out of lockdown. So these measures may be a short-term strategy, but they cannot be a long-term one. And in a second lockdown, everyone knows it can happen more than once. What's tolerable as a one-off looks less so when it seems like a repeated occurrence. As others have said, lockdown is hard on our mental health, harder still when it's dark and wet outside, and all this, I'm afraid, affects likely compliance with these restrictions. And if people don't comply, the health benefits of a lockdown disappear altogether. So there has to be clarity on how we come out of these restrictions, not just, I'm afraid, on what date the government hopes that we do. So the government must say clearly what objectively we need to see in order to have these restrictions lifted, so everyone can see the way out of them as well as the way in, and thereby, I hope, making it more likely that people will comply with them and more likely that they will have their desired effect.
Edward Timpson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and as the Prime Minister said earlier, none of us want this, pitting lives against livelihoods, and I would also add the quality of our lives. It's excruciating, it's uncomfortable, and it tugs at our values and sensibilities. But the truth is that it is an invidious conundrum with no good options, as my honourable friend has just said. And we can't escape the fact that these measures that we're voting for this evening will come at a significant cost for many people in our constituencies, including mine of Edisbury, whether that's social, financial, or from a mental health perspective. And I take a particular interest in the impact it has on children, who we know through the first lockdown have had a whole range of new experiences, not all of them good, that may play out for many years to come. So I also welcome the fact that schools will remain open during the next 4 weeks. I think that is incredibly important for a whole range of reasons, and I would urge every parent to do their bit in making sure that their child gets the education and all the other benefits from the schools remaining open. I would ask my right honourable friend, the Minister, just to clarify that if a child is classified as clinically vulnerable, whether they're still expected to go to school, as I've had some queries about that. But we also know that there is the financial damage that this will cause, the scarring of the economy as it's sometimes known. And I have highlighted, as my right honourable friend will know, and will again in the debate on Monday in Westminster Hall, the wedding industry, as well as pubs, zoos, beauty salons and so on, as we did in the first lockdown. We can't forget that despite the significant package from the Chancellor to support them, that there are still gaps that need to be filled, and they need some hope for the future. But I do understand that the figures, as we can read them, and I would like to see more granular data in the future, are not good to read. Whether that's the number of COVID patients now in hospital and the trajectory that many of our trusts, our hospital trusts, are telling us that they are on. And so we do need to act, and I will be supporting the measures this evening to do that. But I would urge my right honourable friend, as has been mentioned by other members, that we do need to, as part of this, make sure we don't end up in a vicious cycle of lockdowns, which will do more and more damage as we still try and control the virus. So we do need a plan for how we can live with it in the longer term. What we do next to once we've reduced the R number below 1, to keep it there so that we can continue to reopen the economy, but most of all to give Edisbury residents and businesses the normality, the certainty and the hope that they crave.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When we entered lockdown in March, none of us could be sure how long the measures would be necessary then, or indeed what would be necessary in the future. but we accepted the privations and the limitations on our life to defeat the virus. But we very quickly realised we wouldn't return to normal. We grieved the loss of life and we grieved the loss of livelihoods as well. So it is with a heavy heart that a lot of us have got to contemplate what we're contemplating in this House today. But it is clear, isn't it, that if we look at what many of our constituents are telling us to do, I've only had 2 constituents write to me and say I should support the government tonight, and I have a responsibility to those constituents. But we as members of Parliament have a greater responsibility as well. We have a responsibility to our constituents, and we have a responsibility to our country. And whatever we think about we should have persevered with the tier system, or whether we think the restrictions have been too onerous on any sorts of activities, and I want to touch on a couple in a moment, no responsible government and no responsible Secretary of State could sit and not listen to the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence. And I regret that that is where it is, but it must be right that we cannot allow the National Health Service the right, as several members of people have said, to enjoy the health, that right to health that we mustn't threaten if we can avoid doing so. And therefore, with some reluctance, as my right honourable friend knows, I'm going to support the government tonight. Reluctance because I say to him, there is, if we do these measures by consent, and if you look at some of what the government has set out tonight, there are huge contradictions in some of the guidance and some of the regulations. And still the government hasn't the chance to clarify those, and it should do so. The most obvious, of course, is about the off-sale of beers, where the regulations clearly say you can do so, but the guidance this morning still hasn't been changed. That's maybe not the most important one. Some of the guidance on educational establishments and what they're able to do is much worse and hasn't been clarified. But can I say to him, the inconsistencies as well. Why can I go for a run where someone could cough and splutter, but I couldn't play a round of golf? Like so many of my fellow members of this House, I regret that we are putting privations and restrictions on a huge numbers of people who wish to worship and express their faith. And I say to my right honourable friend, I hope that the observation and the commitment that was given to my other right honourable friend will be honoured. So I will be supporting the government tonight. But I hope that the government will use the time to make sure it sets out clearly what its targets and objectives are, and sets out clearly that it can stand up the test, track and trace system, and it can set up the new, more widespread testing.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And when looking at this issue and my vote this evening, I look at the evidence and I ask myself 3 questions. Can our local NHS cope? Have we assessed properly the impact of the regional lockdown? And which path will be the least destructive to the health and well-being of the constituents that sent me here to serve them? And when it comes to the local NHS, the figures today show that we have 24 COVID inpatients being treated by East Sussex county hospitals. Of those, a third are being treated in the community. Not one of them is in a high dependency unit. The NHS system in East Sussex coped fantastically last time and has learnt lessons, and this is another important aspect. They've learnt lessons on how to treat people, the oxygen levels required, life-saving COVID treatments such as dexamethasone. They have a better understanding on how to treat, and that matters, Madam Deputy Speaker. So when looking at the evidence of the regional lockdown, I just do not believe that we have given it significant time to properly tell us whether it is working or not. Data coming out of University College London suggests that the R rate is close to or at the rate of 1, and the words coming out of Imperial College suggest it's too early to tell. The daily average has now gone down to 20,018. And so what that again tells me, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we should have given more time to determine the regional lockdowns before we shut down other parts of the country where COVID rates, as they are in East Sussex, were low. And then it comes to which path will be the least destructive. And again, I've asked for evidence to show that the destruction and damage caused to people's lives, their livelihoods, will actually be worse off if we did not take these measures. And this evidence has not been provided to me. And it's very difficult to make a decision when we've not got 2 competing sets of analysis. And I've been asked, Madam Deputy Speaker, have I met anybody who has lost a loved one through COVID? And the answer to that is, tragically, yes, I have, and the heart goes out to them. But I have also attended the funeral of a friend in the last year who took his life, having lost his job. I have met people who have not attended hospital appointments and now have terminal illnesses and wish to goodness they had. I have met people who suffer domestic abuse behind closed doors that is not uncovered. I have met people who have lost their jobs and the roof over their heads because they have lost everything in life and they have become destitute. And I have also experienced people with a mental health torture from isolationism and loneliness for which they cannot recover. Those lives matter too. And because I cannot see any evidence showing that there could be more of those lives impacted than the lives we save, I'm unable to support and I will vote against these measures this evening.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this decision facing us today has big implications for how we recover from this pandemic and how we take the people with us. So I'm pleased we're at least having a vote on it, and I've kept an open mind to listen to the debate. And I know the government has a very difficult balance to take, and a judgment call to make based on the clinical advice, what the economy is saying, and what people are saying, what is sustainable for their compliance. And let's be clear, there is no risk-free option. It's all about a balance and management of risk. But the advice from clinical experts, I'm afraid, is too often confusing and contradictory. Why is SAGE using predictions of 4,000 fatalities per day, as my right honourable friend from Maidenhead has said, but the actual figure turns out to be 1,000 at most? Why can projections just a couple of weeks or 10 days ago turn out to be so wrong that they have to be revised so sharply? Is not the problem we seem to be conflating scenarios with forecasts too often? And where is the clarity over how many of these deaths might reasonably be expected to have been seasonal flu deaths if COVID was not a thing? What weighting is being given to the rise in non-COVID deaths at home because people with cancer, heart disease and other conventional killers are not getting the treatment in hospital which has been reconfigured almost exclusively to deal with COVID, let alone the impact we're seeing on suicide, on stillbirth rates and on babies. And now we're talking about a third wave. How many more waves are we going to have? So clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, the science is not black and white science. And therefore we really need to look at the impact of all the measures holistically and not just what one set of scientists is telling us. Now, the impact on business is of greatest concern, as many honourable members have said. The hospitality industry being hit hugely. The service industry relying on the hospitality industry almost forgotten. The already struggling small, apparently non-essential shops just stocked up for Christmas, losing their trade to supermarkets and garden centres up the road. The aviation and international tourism industry, the impact on travel agents who can't furlough because they've got to work to process the refunds for which they get absolutely no payment at all. Madam Deputy Speaker, for many, this is economic death by 1,000 cuts, a salami slicing of business, and the resulting redundancies and bankruptcies, reduced wages, will affect the livelihoods and lives of so many of our constituents. At the very least, we should have an economic audit of the impact of lockdown, which feeds into and challenges the scientific advice. And the other crucial factor is what people are prepared to accept and follow, and that is linked to confidence in the explanations which they are being given. And when you see apparent contradictions, like go and exercise, but you can't play golf, you can't play tennis, children can't exercise outside, you can't go to church, then clearly when logic is not being applied to those, people's confidence is trashed. National lockdown is a big step. The science for it is questionable. The business case against it is overwhelming. Why are we doing it at this stage before we've seen the effects of regional lockdowns? So for me, Madam Deputy Speaker, the case is not proven, the measures proposed are not proportionate, and I can't vote for them.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know whether it's a pleasure or with huge difficulty I follow those two very powerful speeches from my neighbours down in the South East, the member for Bexhill and Battle and the member for East Worthing and Shoreham. Like most people in this chamber, this has been an agonising decision, but it hasn't been made easy by the government or the front bench. By putting forward data that has inconsistencies, by putting forward data that has inflated projections, it's been incredibly hard in constituencies like mine, which are very rare near the R rate of 1, to explain to them why we need to go into a national lockdown. Many of us fought for the right to have this debate and this vote The right thing to do by the front bench would have been to share the data that they have that enables them to make those decisions, to share them with us, so we could argue with them amongst our constituencies up and down the country instead of spending all of our time trying to argue with the government and get hold of the data in the first place. As the member for Bexhill and Battle has already laid out, in the South East it's a very different picture. We don't have a huge amount of infection rates, we don't have a huge number of beds overtaken by COVID patients, and all of our local health practitioners are explaining to us that that won't be the case either for many months down the line. So I would have preferred to have seen the tier system. I would have preferred to see the tier system play out for a period of time and to see how it was working. But I keep being told that we need a national decision, a national endeavour. It is one national health service, and that the Prime Minister has no other choice but to put us into a national lockdown. So I will be reluctantly supporting the government tonight, but with a caveat. I am putting the Minister and the government on 28 days' notice. They've had many months, but now, over that short period, they need to put in place a public health strategy that works for the whole country, not just for the North and the Midlands, but for me, in Wilden, that means taking care of the most vulnerable. That's people in my care homes. If we can test, track and trace in Liverpool, I want the same applied to family members who wish to visit their members in care homes. I'm still hearing from my care home staff that they can't get hold of tests, and when they do, they're never returned in decent time. And we need real financial analysis of the decisions that we're taking. When people lose their jobs, they lose their security, they lose their homes, it impacts their mental health. It's just more than a job, it's everything else as well. In a short period of time, I just want to raise a point that's been made by many members already. I feel that we are overstepping the mark as a country, as a government, as the Conservative Party, by putting down legislation how people live their lives in their private homes. That is not a space we should enter easily. And in my experience, when men, institutions and governments get hold of that power, they give it up very reluctantly.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there have been many powerful contributions today, not least by my predecessor, my honourable friend for Wealden and others, stressing the importance of liberties, lives and livelihoods in these difficult decisions the government is taking. The argument for the 28-day lockdown too hinges on the capacity and resources of the NHS and the threat nationwide of our hospitals not being able to cope in the season most favourable for the spread of this virus. The national data is convincing and the international evidence compelling, but at a local level it varies. So my neighbour, the Right Honourable Member for the Forest of Dean, has made the case that it is hard to support restrictions on the lives, livelihoods and liberties of his constituents, given the relatively low numbers of COVID patients there. But the argument that persuades me is that no area ultimately is an island. Those who live in Gloucestershire, whether in the rural or the towns, all depend on the Gloucester Royal Hospital in my constituency for E&A treatment of this virus. And while I believe that our hospital does have the staff, ventilators and beds to withstand a second wave on its own, there is a real risk of mutual aid being called, whether for Bristol, Swindon or other cities nearby. And that would increase the scale of the challenge for us considerably. And so, because ultimately the rural areas, wherever they are in our nation, with lower rates of infection do depend on the hospitals in our cities in their hour of need, we have to accept this temporary new closure with huge reluctance and sadness for what it means for many of our constituents. Now, this bill, a statutory instrument, is not amendable this evening, but I hope that the Secretary of State, who I'm sure is listening hard, and his colleagues will continue to fine-tune the detail and the guidance, because balancing what I called in October the small joys in lives with risks to infection rates is important in a democracy where only consensus and agreement to comply will deliver the result that we all want. The letter, in this context, from the leaders of all the major faiths is the single largest plea in numbers of lives and well-being touched. The voices supporting visits to care homes, gyms and other things precious to constituents are also important, within an acceptance of the second lockdown, and these voices must be heard. In cities like ours, with a cathedral, dozens of churches, and a handful of mosques, and adherents of the Hindu, Jewish and Sikh faiths as well, the freedom to pray is welcome, but the freedom to worship together is one I strongly support, and I urge the Prime Minister to ensure this come back with a return to local tiers on December the 2nd.
Steve Baker.
These are extreme measures for extreme times. I think I found myself agreeing with every word of what my right honourable friends for Altrincham, Sale West and Broxbourne said, but I have forced myself against my instincts to confront the reality of the government's arguments, and I want to say a big thank you to the Secretary of State and to the Prime Minister for giving me a privileged opportunity to take scientists into Number 10 to interrogate the data. I confess it was as a red team, as I said in public. I was rather hoping that we would take the wheels off the data and thereby stop this lockdown altogether, and I'm sorry that that has not been possible. The best argument for the government's policy is the one I put in a Telegraph article earlier, the argument that with an R above 1, perhaps to 1.5, from which is a level, it's easier to suppress to 1.5 than below 1, I understand. But the best argument is that with that plateauing phenomenon, you get intolerable pressure on the NHS. And because Professor Whitty had to, if not correct, then clarify the record of what he said yesterday to the Select Committee, I went back to see what my right honourable friend said to me about Liverpool's cases when I intervened on him Monday, I think. And I pay tribute to him because on this complex subject, he did not get it wrong. He got it right. I've checked very carefully and I'm sure he got it right. But the reality is that there are different data sets. If we look at what Professor Tim Spector said, he tweeted out further evidence today from our Zoe CSS survey that we've passed the peak in the second wave of new cases in the UK. There'll be a 4-week lag before this is seen in a decline to deaths and 1 to 2 weeks in hospitalisation. The R value is close to 1 in most areas now. But the point I want to make is this. The government's strategy, as advocated by some of the best scientists, it's been my privilege to meet them, relies upon a bet that science will deliver vaccines, improved testing, improved treatments. And I'm delighted that people are optimistic about it. But I'm being asked now to impose the most enormous costs on my constituency and on my country on a bet about science delivering in an environment where there are contested data sets, including a data set which suggests are going below 1. And I'm not able to do it. It's with a heavy heart and many misgivings that I will be voting no tonight. And I really wish I had the clarity on either side of the argument, which is occasionally held and expressed in this House and much more routinely expressed outside. I want to make a point about compliance. If we have this lockdown and it's not complied with, it will be a disaster. We can have no more innovative eye test procedures in the course of this lockdown. There must be compliance and a good example set. In 28 days, I will not behave in the way I have this week. I'll continue to behave responsibly in working with the government, but there will be no equivocation about my views in 28 days. We've got to learn to live with this virus, deliver on the new science, reform expert advice, reform modelling, and improve standards in government so that never again do we see a model like this which evaporates like morning mist under the sunlight of close inspection.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And 48 hours ago, I came to the House and asked them to sharpen the axe with regards to the measures being put in place. Today, the House will decide whether to use that axe. This is a Rubicon moment with a national Sophie's choice. If we use it, we are going to impact the biggest impact we have on civil liberties since the war. We're going to cause economic damage, job losses, and mortally wound businesses. There will be mental health problems, and we'll indebt our children and our children's children. On the other hand, do nothing. The NHS surge capacity is likely to be breached. The quagmire of COVID will actually kill off all the non-COVID cancer, stroke and joint operations. More people will be left with long COVID, and the staff will be struggling to cope, facing burnout, or worse still, literally having to choose between whose mother, father, grandfather or grandmother will get treatment. This is a horror choice for any government, and I think it is right that the 650 representatives from across the country will make this decision. Now, unfortunately, there is no double-blind trial running where there's a second UK where we can see what else is happening. We have to make a judgment call on what we think might happen. So for me, the concern is over the surge capacity. And in the Health Select Committee, we have seen evidence of what happens when this is breached. In Italy, there were many, many oversubscribed beds that people could not get treatment. People over 60 were written off purely on their age. Now, many in the House may well find themselves written off for that very reason. And in Spain, there were nursing homes that were abandoned with people in them. We have to take that seriously. And if you think it can't happen here, I ask you to look at the letter you received from the NHS providers this morning that represent all 216 trusts. And they ask us to support this motion as urgent action is needed. Now, I spoke before about this virus has opened Pandora's box, and we need hope. That hope comes in ingenuity of vaccines. But until then, I believe our communities will follow the lockdown rules. I believe that the Treasury should continue to actively listen and do its darndest to support businesses and jobs. And I believe that mass testing must be rolled out so that people can get a test and carry on their daily living. And I will support the lockdown, but hold the government to account to mitigate the impact of their using this tool and make sure that we cut down this COVID pandemic.
Neil. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a profound moment that we are being asked knowingly to restrict the civil liberties of our fellow citizens to an unprecedented degree in peacetime, and knowingly and deliberately to harm the economic welfare and, in some cases, the personal welfare of our fellow citizens, because lockdowns have consequences and lockdowns themselves do damage. And in deciding whether or not that can ever be acceptable in a country that believes in the rule of law, it is important to consider whether or not such measures are necessary, are proportionate, and are supported by evidence. Well, I accept that the COVID pandemic is an emergency of a kind that can make such draconian measures necessary. I regret to say, however, that I do not believe that the measures set out in these regulations are either proportionate or based upon the evidence. I don't doubt the Secretary of State and the government's good intentions, but the details of the measures go beyond that which are appropriate, it seems to me, to achieve the objective that is set out. And I think we could refer perhaps to the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law's briefing and the reference there to the late Sir John Laws and his description of doing that, the minimum which is necessary, in effect, to achieve the objective with the minimum intrusion upon civil liberties. I'm afraid some of the measures here go beyond that. There is no scientific basis for the banning of non-contact outdoor sports. There is no scientific basis for treating grassroots football and community sport differently to elite sports in those fields. There is no scientific basis for preventing and indeed criminalising people of faith going to collective worship when they do so in a safe fashion, foregoing the right to join in communal hymn singing or music to limit the risks of transmission. That goes beyond that which is proportional. There is no economic impact as to the disbenefits to businesses. I've seen family businesses with 20 years standing already go under in my constituency. I cannot vote to support that without clear evidence as to why that is necessary, the extent to that which is likely to continue, and what the plan is to come out of the other side of this in good order. So, with a heavy heart, I cannot support the government in the lobbies today. Because these measures are not amendable, I would have been prepared to look at a more limited, more proportionate form of regulations, but it goes beyond it. And an example of the short notice that we've had to consider these measures, the poor drafting of them, is that you're allowed, for example, to go to an estate agent under the regulations, but you cannot go to your solicitor. But the documentation that you will need to get a mortgage and to move house will frequently need to be witnessed in person by the solicitor. These are poorly drafted regulations, and that's a simple and one of only many examples of that, and why I can't support them.
Anna Davison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's with a heavy heart that I stand today to support the government's proposals for a national lockdown, which incidentally are supported by 55% of Bishop Auckland residents, according to a local survey I ran this week. But let me begin by making this perfectly clear. The notions of freedom and liberty remain at the core of my values, of my ideology, and of my very ethos. And it goes entirely against my instincts to impose restrictions on the freedoms of our residents. I certainly didn't come into politics to tell people why they could leave their homes, who they could visit, whether they could spend time with their families, and to tell people they aren't allowed to go out on a first date. Now, this is not a decision that any of us will take lightly, but I believe we must make the choice to do the next right thing and support this 4-week lockdown. And we know that the next 4 weeks are going to be difficult. I remember all too well the solitude of living on my own during the first lockdown and what that did to my mental state. And that is a tiny speck of nothing compared to what some of our constituents have gone through. People have lost loved ones, either to COVID or to other illnesses that COVID left undetected. And my deepest condolences go out to everyone affected in that way. And mental health, an issue very close to my heart, continues to decline for so many across our communities. And each of us must do all we can to support them in the difficult, dark nights ahead. Many businesses are facing unprecedented difficulties, and each of those means a group of employees desperately concerned about their jobs, their livelihoods, and their futures. And I must say I'm incredibly grateful to the Chancellor and to the Treasury team for the support that they have put in place. And I urge them to continue to engage with we MPs, with our businesses, with our local authorities, and with our individual residents to ensure that we can continue to support as many people as possible through this period of economic hardship. So I hear people ask, how then can I justify voting for these restrictions today? And the answer is because I'm thinking about the future of our freedom. Like all of us, I want to see life return to normal as soon as possible. I want to see children playing with their friends, students celebrating Freshers' Week, and couples having the big weddings of their dreams. And I want to see families able to get together to celebrate Christmas. But to get our freedoms back means biting the bullet now, acting decisively and suppressing the virus through this time-restricted lockdown. We will defeat this virus. Of that, I am completely confident. We will return to the sunlit uplands of hope, optimism, and promise, and we'll be able to refocus all our efforts, not on an unexpected global pandemic, but on rebuilding our country, as the PM says, building back better, levelling up those left-behind areas, and massively increasing opportunities for people in Bishop Auckland and beyond. Madam Deputy Speaker, in order to reach the light, we first have to go through the tunnel. And I know once again that our communities will join hands to make it through this difficult phase. And I know that in doing so, we will eventually emerge into a brighter post-COVID future.
Jonathan Ashworth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This afternoon, members have spoken with sincerity and eloquence. And I think it's clear that the House would have benefited, the legislation, the regulations would have been improved, and indeed our constituents would have expected a full day of debate, because we are invited to endorse a long, hard lockdown which the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster himself conceded at the weekend could well need to stretch beyond the beginning of September. Now, we on this side will endorse the regulations before the House tonight, because for all the disputes about graphs and modelling, the trends are clear. General and acute beds are filling up. Critical care beds are filling up. More people will die over the next 2 to 3 weeks because we didn't act sooner. But our constituents will want to know there is a plan, and it is still not clear what the criteria will be used to judge whether the lockdown should be lifted. Is it bringing the nationwide R under one? Is it falling hospital admissions? Is it lower prevalence rates amongst the over 60s? Is it a prevalence with which contact tracing is effective? I hope the Secretary of State can answer that. And I want to underline 3 quick points that members across the House have raised. John Steinbeck wrote, "A sad soul can kill you quicker, far quicker than a germ." Now, it's not entirely biologically correct, but we understand the point. Loneliness and isolation extract a heavy mental and physical toll. So will the Secretary of State guarantee that a mental health plan for the winter, and will services continue to be accessible either online or face-to-face? At times of crisis, many of our constituents find solace through faith and communion of congregational prayer. Churches, mosques, temples, gurdwaras, synagogues have gone to great lengths, often at great cost by volunteers, to make themselves COVID secure. We have Diwali coming up soon, Many mosques have been in touch with me. If individual prayer in the church or the masjid is allowed with social distancing in place, then why not congregational prayer? And with respect to social care, I understand the Secretary of State has published some guidance and visits will be allowed outside or behind screens. That is welcome. But perhaps could he use the mass testing that is now coming online to allow relatives to be tested so they can see their relatives inside in the care home and perhaps even hug their relatives? Many will fear that this is the last Christmas for many of their loved ones in care homes. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, what happens next? The Paymaster General yesterday warned of further lockdowns, but a hokey-cokey of lockdowns has to be avoided. This virus is controllable with the correct measures in place. So we urge the Secretary of State to use these 4 weeks to quickly expand the saliva testing to all NHS staff and key workers. Secondly, we need tracing teams led locally, doing the detective work to identify the super-spreading events with retrospective tracing. East Asian countries are avoiding lockdowns with this cluster-busting approach. We should institute it here. We need decent sick pay and support for those isolating, and we need to improve ventilation systems in public buildings. And finally, we need a plan for Christmas. When the lockdown ends, thousands of students will be travelling the country to go home. What is the government's plan to keep us safe through the Christmas and New Year period? But tonight we will support these measures, but we are demanding our constituents pay a huge price. We are demanding our constituents make greater sacrifice because of a failure to act sooner.
Secretary of State Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And these measures that we've just debated are indeed extraordinary measures in response to an extraordinary threat to our nation's health and prosperity. And the measures do not come easily to me, nor to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and nor should they to this House. Our historic liberties are hard-won and precious, and they should not be infringed save the gravest of times. But these are grave times indeed, and if we do not act now, then we know that the NHS could not have been able to cope. And I know that no member of this House wants to see the scenes that we've witnessed elsewhere in the world of hospitals overrun, or of doctors forced to make the choice of who to treat and who to turn away. So we must drive this virus down together and take these tough yet time-limited measures, making sacrifices now for the safety of all. And it won't be easy, I know that, but in a pandemic there are no easy choices. As my honourable friend for Edinburgh put it, we face an invidious choice. We're called upon to make fundamental changes to how we live, work and socialise, but it is in pursuit of a common cause. And while we do so, we must and we will use this time to drive forward the innovations that are going to help us ensure that, if at all possible, this lockdown is the last. The mass testing that's been mentioned by so many, which we've begun to roll out this week and are driving forward night and day. The vaccine, which was mentioned by my honourable friend, the member for South Wiltshire and others, which, while not yet assured, we will be ready to roll out as soon as we safely can, and the treatments that this country has pioneered. Now, there have been some excellent speeches, all made with a heavy heart and with regard to the seriousness of the situation. My right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, spoke of the need to assess the impact not only on health but also on the economy. And we know that the economic impact of these measures will be significant. We know that, but we also know that if this virus continues to rise and continues to double, then the economic impact will be serious still more. Many members raised the impact on mental health, and I take this very seriously. I consulted before supporting this decision with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and they have said that stricter measures to control the virus are needed because the virus itself has a negative impact on people's mental health. And there's a wider point, both for mental health services and more broadly, that the NHS is open. We're determined to ensure that it stays open as much as is possible for non-COVID treatments. And my honourable friend, the member for Bexhill and Battle, for whom I have a huge amount of respect, argued passionately about the impact of the first lockdown on the health services available. And I say to him with all sincerity, it is by tackling the rise in the virus that we will keep the NHS open, rather than by allowing the virus to grow. And in his constituency, the number of cases has doubled in the last 2 weeks, almost doubled. I looked it up as he was speaking. So I would urge him and others who support the NHS so strongly to support these measures in order to allow the NHS to continue to do its job. Yes, of course.
The Prime Minister very honestly said to me on Monday that one of the lessons from the end of lockdown 1 was that we didn't insist enough on people isolating when they were contacted by test and trace. Going forward, at the end of lockdown 2.0, how will we improve on that?
Constant need to improve on that. Firstly, the number of people being contacted and who are isolating has risen sharply. Secondly, while of course there's always a need for more, the proportion has started to rise recently, and the amount of resources and support that we're giving to the test and trace service continues to grow. So I absolutely support the point that my honourable friend's making, that we must use this month to ensure that that service is there and ready. But those who've said that it doesn't have any impact, I think are wrong. It is having a significant impact on bringing the R down from its natural elevated rate of around 2.5 to where it is today. But with the R above 1, the virus continues to grow, and we must bring it down. A number of colleagues on all sides of the House raised the issue of communal worship, and my right honourable friend for Gainsborough, my honourable friend for Gloucester, and I can tell the House that ministers are talking to faith leaders to do everything we can to reach an accommodation as soon as possible. I understand the impact of this infringement on liberties, as many colleagues mentioned. We saw support for the measures from across the House. The honourable member for Aberfan talked about how furlough must be fair for all, and we've extended the furlough system. My honourable friend for Wimbledon talked about the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence. And while science, of course, consists of men and women with different views, I truly believe that the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence is in favour of suppressing the virus. We heard from my honourable friend for Wealdon and Loughborough about how with heavy hearts they're supporting these measures. My right honourable friend for Kenilworth and Southern talked about taking damaging decisions to prevent a disastrous outcome later, and I think that was about right. The members for Reading East and for Blackburn expressed their support, even though they also said that they wished that this had come in earlier. My right honourable friend from East Hampshire and my honourable friend for Bosworth and South West Bedfordshire, they all spoke so eloquently of what it means, that promise that the NHS is always there for you. It's something that binds us together as a country, and it's something that we must protect and cherish. The issue of care homes was raised, including by the honourable member for the front bench opposite. The visitor guidance was published, updated visitor guidance was published this morning, and I agree with him about seeking the further expansion of testing for care homes, including for visitors. There was a widespread debate about the need for more data publication. All I can say is that we're constantly expanding the data that's being published. More and more data from the NHS on hospitalisations, more and more data on cases and where they are, contact tracing data. So I am absolutely enthusiastic about publishing more and more data. We have indeed been commended as a country for the open approach that we're taking in terms of the amount of data that is published. But ultimately this comes to a very significant judgment. It comes to a judgment about how we best manage a nation and lead a nation through an incredibly difficult period with a pandemic of a virus that exists only to multiply, and a virus that lives and breathes off the essence of what it is to be human. My honourable friend, the member for Broxbourne, spoke with a passion of freedom, and I too am a lover of freedom. But I also care about protection, and it is the combination of the two that we must balance and address. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in ordinary times, these measures would be unimaginable. But these are not ordinary times. It's a virus in circulation that feeds off the human contact that makes life worth living, and we must act to thwart its deadly march, to protect our NHS, and to save countless lives. While we support every person, and with everything we've got, support the science that with increasing confidence each day I know will help us to find a better way through, and I commend these regulations to the House.
Order. The question is, as on the order paper. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. Order! Honourable members, apart from front benches, should be leaving this chamber by the doors behind me, please. We must try to keep social distancing going, and it's simply wrong for people to... Order! Other than front benchers, everyone should be leaving by the doors behind me.
I am. You'll tell us with the nose.
The question is, as on the order paper. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Tom Pursglove and Leo Docherty. Tellers for the noes, Philip Hollowbone and Steve Baker. Lock the doors. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 516. The noes to the left, 38.
The ayes to the right, 516. The noes to the left, 38. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Agriculture Bill. Consideration of Lord's message.
Now. Queen's consent. Thank you. We begin with the government motion to disagree with the Lords in their Amendment 16B, with which it will be convenient to consider Lord's Amendment 18B and the government motion to disagree with